Silas Whitaker rose from his own engagement dinner, knocked his wine glass to the floor, and walked straight out into a blizzard, while 40 guests sat frozen in stunned silence. Margaret Holloway, the bride the whole valley expected him to marry, screamed his name, and he didn't turn around. He'd heard something outside. No one else noticed a woman's voice, thin and dying, calling for help in the storm. Minutes later, Silas Whitaker was on his knees in a snowdrift, pulling a freezing stranger into his arms and ending his own engagement without a second thought. If you believe real love chooses character over comfort, hit subscribe and stay with me to the very end. Drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from tonight. I read every single one, and I love seeing how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it began. Silas Whitaker stood up so fast his chair cracked against the floorboards, and 40 guests in their Sunday best went silent all at once. "Silas?" Margaret Holloway's voice cracked down the middle. She was still holding her wine glass halfway to her lips, still wearing the smile she'd practiced in the mirror all week. "Silas, what in God's name?" He wasn't looking at her anymore. He was looking past her, past the long table dressed in white linen, past the candles and the roast and the fine china the Holloways had borrowed from 3 different families to make this dinner look like the grandest engagement Red Creek Valley had ever seen. He was looking at the door. "You hear that?" he said. Nobody answered. Nobody had heard anything but the fiddle player tuning up in the corner and old man Holloway clearing his throat to start another toast to the future Mr. and Mrs. Whitaker. Silas heard it again, thin, broken. A woman's voice out past the porch, swallowed almost whole by the wind. He walked. "Silas Whitaker, you get back to this table." Randall Holloway barked, half rising, his napkin still tucked in his collar. "We are not finished here." "I am," Silas said, and he didn't slow down to say it kindly. He crossed the parlor in 6 strides, shouldered the front door open into a night that had turned mean and white in the last hour. Snow coming sideways, now biting. Margaret was screaming his name behind him, high and furious. The kind of scream a woman gives when she understands all at once that something has slipped through her fingers she never once imagined she could lose. Silas didn't hear the scream anymore. He'd stopped hearing anything but that other voice. He found her 20 yards off the porch, past the hitching post, half buried already. A shape in the snow that didn't look like it belonged to the living. He went down on his knees so hard the impact jarred up through his spine and didn't feel it. Not really, not with his hands already moving, digging her free, pulling a mess of soaked skirts and matted hair up out of the drift. Ma'am, can you hear me?" Her eyes opened. Barely. A sliver of brown beneath lashes crusted white. "Please," she whispered. That was all. One word, and it cost her everything she had left to say it. Silas Whitaker had turned down every eligible woman in 3 counties for reasons he'd never fully explained to another living soul. He had broken a room full of hearts and 100 family plans, and he had done it calmly, politely, without a flicker of regret, because none of those women had ever once looked at him like they needed anything from him but his name and his land. 3 years back there had been Eliza Prescott, and for a while Silas had let himself believe that was going to be the whole of his story. He'd courted her proper, brought her flowers, he'd picked himself. Instead of told her things about his mother and his boyhood he hadn't told another soul. He'd been fixing to ask her father for her hand the same week. A surveyor came through the valley and let slip over cards at the saloon that the Whitaker land sat on a vein of good coal nobody had thought to look for. Eliza had heard about it by supper. She was gone by the following spring, married to a mining man from 2 counties over, who could offer her a bigger house sooner. She hadn't even bothered to return the ring in person. She'd sent it by post, wrapped in a note that talked more about timing than about love. Silas had told himself it didn't matter. He had the ranch. He had his name. He didn't need a wife who loved him, only so long as loving him was convenient. But some nights alone in a house too big for one man, he'd wondered what it might feel like to be wanted for something other than what he owned. This woman was dying in his arms, and the only thing she'd asked him for was help. He scooped her up like she weighed nothing, though she did not weigh nothing, and he did not care, and he started walking back toward the house at a dead run. Behind him, the door was full of people. Now lanterns held high faces, twisted up in confusion and horror, and on more than one face, undisguised disgust. "Silas, what are you doing?" Margaret had come out onto the porch without her shawl shivering, mascara starting to run. "Who is that? Put her down this instant, you're getting her filth all over your good coat." "Get Doc Meyer," Silas said. He didn't look at her. "Now, somebody ride for Doc Meyer, or I will leave this dinner and do it myself." "This is our engagement dinner." Silas said. The word landed in the yard like a dropped plate, and every single guest heard it break. Randall Holloway's face went the color of a bad sunset. "You will regret this, Whitaker. You understand me. Every family in this valley is standing in my parlor tonight, and you are about to humiliate my daughter in front of every one of them over some vagrant you found in a snowbank." "She ain't a vagrant," Silas said. "She's a woman freezing to death 40 feet from your table while you were pouring champagne." He didn't wait to see Randall's reaction. He carried the woman past all of them up the steps into the warm gold light of the Holloway parlor and laid her down across two chairs, pushed together because there wasn't a bed close enough, and every second mattered now. Her lips had gone the color of a bruise. Her hands, when he chafed them between his own, were stiff as green wood. "Stay with me," he told her low, only for her. "You hear? Whatever fight got you out into that storm, you keep fighting it right here. Don't you dare quit now." Somewhere behind him, in a room gone suddenly and completely silent, Margaret Holloway watched the man she'd believed was about to be her husband kneel on her mother's good rug and beg a stranger to live. Doc Meyer arrived within the half-hour, snow still melting off his coat-black bag, already open before he'd finished crossing the threshold. "Somebody get me hot water, blankets all you've got, and clear this room, I need space to work." Nobody moved. "Now!" Doc Meyer snapped, and that broke the spell enough that two of the Holloway house girls scattered for the kitchen. Silas stayed. "You too, Whitaker," the doctor said without looking up, already pressing two fingers to the woman's throat, counting something grim behind his eyes. "Unless you've got medical training I don't know about." "I'm not leaving her." Doc Meyer glanced up, then took in the set of Silas's jaw, and apparently decided arguing about it would waste time neither of them had. "Then make yourself useful. Hold her feet up. Circulation's near stopped in them. We need blood moving back toward her heart before frostbite takes what the cold hasn't already." Silas did as he was told. He'd handled panicked horses and men gored by longhorns, and he had never in his life felt his hands shake the way they shook. Now lifting this stranger's ruined boots onto a stack of borrowed pillows. "She got a name?" Doc Meyer asked. Working a needle and thread from his bag, glancing at a gash along her hairline Silas hadn't even noticed in the dark. "Don't know." "You don't know her name, but you left your own engagement dinner to save her life." "That about sums it," Silas said. Doc Meyer almost smiled. Almost. "Well, wouldn't be the first time a man's good sense left him quicker than his boots could carry him. Hold this bandage right here, press firm. Don't let up till I say." Behind them in the doorway, Randall Holloway stood with his arms crossed and his jaw working like a man chewing on something too big to swallow and too proud to spit out. Margaret had disappeared upstairs somewhere, and the sound that carried down through the floorboards every few minutes wasn't crying exactly. It was something closer to fury with the volume turned down. "She's got frostbite in 3 fingers," Doc Meyer said finally, sitting back on his heels, wiping his hands on a cloth gone pink. "Might lose the tips of 2 of them if we're not careful the next few days. Concussion likely from that cut. Malnourished bad, I'd guess she hasn't had a full meal in going on 2 weeks, maybe longer. Whoever she is, Whitaker, she has been fighting to stay alive on her own for a good long while before tonight. She'll live. She's got a stronger heartbeat than any half-dead woman's got a right to. I'd say that's a yes if we keep her warm and keep her fed slow, and if she wants to." "She'll want to," Silas said with a certainty that surprised even himself. She woke near dawn. Silas hadn't left the parlor. He'd sat in a hard-backed chair pulled up beside the makeshift bed for 6 hours through Randall Holloway's furious muttering, and the eventual dispersal of every last horrified guest through the fire burning down twice, and being built back up through his own mind, turning over and over the same simple, unbearable fact: he did not know this woman's name, and he had just ended an engagement 3 years in the making to save her life, and he did not regret 1 second of it. Her eyes opened slow, unfocused, then sharpened on him like she was deciding whether he was real. "You're the one," she said. Her voice came out cracked and small, but there was something steady underneath it, something that hadn't broken even when the rest of her nearly had. "The one who dug me out." "Yes, ma'am." "Why?" The question caught him flat-footed. Nobody had ever asked him that before, not like she meant it, not fishing for a compliment, not testing him, just genuinely wanting to understand why a stranger would give up something warm and easy for something cold and hard, lying half dead in the snow. "Because you were dying," Silas said, "and I happened to be close enough to do something about it. Lot of men wouldn't have troubled themselves. Lot of men are fools." That got something out of her. Not quite a laugh. She didn't have the strength for a laugh, but the corner of her mouth moved just barely, and Silas felt that small motion land somewhere in his chest, like a stone dropped in still water. "What's your name?" he asked. "Clara," she said. "Clara Bennett." "Silas Whittaker, I know who you are." She tried to push herself up on one elbow, and winced hard enough that Silas was half out of his chair before she waved him back down with her good hand. "Whole Valley knows the name Whittaker. Biggest ranch this side of the territory line. Man who turns down every woman fool enough to want him." "You heard about that. Heard about it from a woman selling eggs at the Mercantile who couldn't stop talking about the Holloway engagement dinner happening tonight." Clara's eyes flicked toward the window, toward the gray light just starting to crack the dark. "Reckon I ruined that for you?" "You didn't ruin a thing. Your intended's gonna have a different opinion on that." "She wasn't my intended," Silas said, and found to his own surprise that saying it out loud felt like setting down a sack of stones he'd been carrying uphill for 3 years. "She was an arrangement. Her daddy's cattle my land a wedding to make both families richer. Wasn't ever about anything more than that, and I think we both knew it, even if neither one of us said so." Clara studied him for a long moment, the kind of look that felt like it was peeling back a layer he hadn't offered. "Must be nice," she said, "having people fight over you." "Didn't feel like a fight worth winning." "No," Clara said quietly. "I don't imagine it did." By the time the sun came up proper, word had already started moving through Red Creek Valley, the way word always moved through a town too small to keep a secret and too proud to admit it loved gossip more than church. Silas Whittaker had walked out on Margaret Holloway mid-toast. Silas Whittaker had carried some ragged stranger into the Holloway parlor and refused to leave her side. Silas Whittaker, the most eligible man in 3 counties, had thrown away the biggest match the valley had ever arranged for a woman nobody could put a name to. By noon they had a name. "Clara Bennett," said Ruth Anders, the postmistress, to anyone who'd stand still long enough to listen. "That's the Bennett girl. Used to live out past Miller's Creek with her daddy before he passed, before the bank took the land." "Which bank?" "You know which bank," Ruth said, lowering her voice like the walls themselves might carry it back to the man in question. "Cole's Bank, same as always." Amos Cole owned the only bank for 40 miles and half the paper on half the ranches in the valley, and there wasn't a soul in Red Creek who didn't know it, and there wasn't a soul who said it above a whisper, because Amos Cole had a way of remembering who talked and who didn't. "Poor thing's been on her own since," Ruth went on. "Nobody quite knew where she got to. Guess now we know. Freezing half to death out behind the Holloway place of all spots." What was she doing clear out there? That, Ruth said, is the question everybody's asking. It was 3 days before Clara was strong enough to sit up on her own, and by the second of those 3 days, Silas had moved her from the Holloway parlor, where Randall's cold civility had curdled into something closer to open hostility to his own ranch house with Doc Meyer's blessing, and his housekeeper, Mrs. Odom, fussing over the arrangement of pillows like Clara was some kind of visiting dignitary, instead of a woman who 3 days prior had nearly died in a snowbank. "You didn't have to do this?" Clara told him the first evening she was well enough to sit up and take real food instead of broth. She was eating slow, careful like a woman who'd learned the hard way not to trust that a full plate would still be there if she looked away from it. Bringing me here. Man in your position, you've got a reputation to think about. Had a reputation, Silas said. Reckon I traded it for something better 3 nights back. Folks are talking. Folks always talk. They're saying things about me you probably ought to hear before you decide you want me under your roof. Clara set her fork down, squared her shoulders the way a woman does when she's about to say something she's rehearsed and dreaded saying at the same time. I'm not delicate, Mr. Whitaker, and I'm not going to pretend I don't know what people see when they look at me. I'm a big woman. Always have been. My mama used to say I was built for work, not for waltzing, and she wasn't wrong, and I made my peace with that a long time ago. But I know what a room thinks when a woman my size walks into it, and I know what they'll think when they hear you took me in. So you ought to know that too before you go making any more decisions on my behalf. Silas didn't answer right away. He'd learned in 3 years of watching women maneuver around him like he was a prize horse at auction that the ones who mattered were the ones who told him the truth even when it cost them something to say it. Miss Bennet, he said finally, I've spent 3 years turning down women. The whole valley told me I ought to want on account of what their family owned or what their daddy could offer mine. Never once did any of them ask me what I needed. Never once did any of them dig their own boots out of a snowbank and keep walking toward a stranger's house asking for nothing but a chance to survive the night. I wasn't walking toward your house. I didn't even know whose house it was. Don't matter. You were still walking, still fighting when most folks would have laid down and let the cold take them. He held her gaze steady, the same way he'd hold the gaze of a spooked horse he meant to calm. I don't care what size dress you wear, Miss Bennet. I care that you didn't quit. Clara looked down at her plate for a long moment, and when she looked back up, her eyes were wet, though her voice didn't waver. Nobody said anything like that to me in a long while. Then it was past time somebody did. She was on her feet within the week, moving slow and careful, but moving, and the first thing she did once Doc Meyer cleared her to walk further than the porch was find Silas out by the horse barn and tell him flat out that she wasn't going to sit in his parlor being waited on like some invalid house guest. I've got 2 working hands, she said, holding them up like evidence in a courtroom, the frostbitten fingertips still wrapped but functional. And I know how to use them. You feed me, you house me, I earn it. That's the only way I know how to live under a man's roof without feeling like a debt I can't pay back. You don't owe me anything, Miss Bennet. I know. That's not the point. Clara's chin came up stubborn as a mule deciding the water's too cold to cross. The point is, I want to. Now what needs fixing? Silas almost laughed. Almost. He looked her over, a woman 3 days removed from near death standing in his yard in a borrowed dress 2 sizes too small, demanding work like it was a debt of honor, and something in his chest that had been clenched tight for 3 long years came loose just a fraction of an inch. Kitchen garden's a mess, he admitted. Mrs. Odom's got her hands full with the house, and truth told, my books haven't been looked at proper in longer than I care to say. I can read a ledger. Didn't figure a woman surviving on her own for months would have much use for arithmetic. Clara's look could have curdled milk. Mr. Whitaker, a woman surviving on her own has more use for arithmetic than any banker in this territory. I know exactly how many days a sack of flour lasts if you ration it right, and exactly how much a man can be cheated out of if nobody's watching close enough to catch it. Now, where are those books? The ranch hands didn't know what to make of her. Not at first. Tom Riggins, Silas's foreman going on 11 years, watched Clara cross the yard that first morning with an expression that walked the line between polite and openly doubtful. She was a big woman in a man's old work coat someone had dug out of storage, her hair pinned back, plain and practical boots, 2 sizes too large, stuffed with rags to make them fit, and she was heading straight for the horse pens like she had business there. Ma'am, Tom said, tipping his hat careful as a man stepping around a rattler he wasn't sure was awake. Something I can help you find. Looking for the horse that's been favoring his left foreleg, Clara said. Mrs. Odom mentioned it over breakfast, said nobody could figure what was wrong with him. Tom's eyebrows went up. That'd be Duke. Best cutting horse on the ranch, and he's been off his stride 2 weeks now. Doc's looked at him twice, can't find a thing. Mind if I take a look? Tom glanced past her toward the house, like he was hoping Silas might appear, and settle the question of whether a half-starved houseguest ought to be poking around a valuable animal. Silas didn't appear. Tom sighed and waved a hand toward the pen. Suit yourself, ma'am. He's a gentle one mostly, but he don't take kindly to strangers fussing at his feet. Clara didn't fuss. She approached, slow-talking, low the whole way, in a voice that dropped into something almost musical, and Duke's 16 hands of nervous muscle, who'd put 2 stable boys on their backsides that same week, stood dead still and let her run a hand down his shoulder along his leg, lift his hoof with a gentleness that made Tom Riggins forget for a second to look skeptical. There, Clara said after a minute of careful pressing. Feel that swelling right along the tendon there. He hasn't gone lame, but he's compensating, favoring that leg to keep weight off it. My daddy raised horses before the bank took our land. This one's been overworked on hard ground. Probably that rocky stretch out past the north pasture if you've been running him out there. Tom's jaw actually dropped. We have been running him out there. Been trying to build his wind up for the spring roundup. Well, you've been building a strain injury instead. Rest him 2 weeks cold compress morning and night and keep him off hard ground till the swelling's gone down. He'll be fine. Man who trained him just didn't have the ear to hear him complaining. Doc Meyer called out that same afternoon at Tom's insistence, examined the leg, pressed his thumb along the same spot Clara had, and gave a low whistle. She's right, he said, straightening up, looking at Silas with an expression somewhere between amusement and genuine surprise. Tendon strain plain as day, once you know to look for it. I missed it twice. Your house guest didn't miss it once. Word of that got around the ranch faster than word of the engagement dinner had gotten around the valley. 2 weeks in, Clara found the mistake in the books. She'd taken to sitting at the kitchen table each evening after supper, ledgers spread out in front of her, a stub of pencil behind her ear, working through years of Whitaker Ranch accounts with the same patient, methodical attention she'd once given to stretching a sack of flour across a hungry winter. Silas had gotten into the habit of joining her there, ostensibly to answer questions about the operation, though more and more he found himself simply watching her work. The small furrow between her brows when a column didn't add up. Right, the satisfied huff of breath when she finally traced an error back to its source. That particular night, the huff of breath came out sharper than usual. Silas. She almost never used his given name. When she did, it meant something had shifted enough to warrant it. How long have you been buying feed from Whitfield's supply? Going on 6 years. And you've never had another supplier check his pricing against the going rate? Never had reason to. Whitfield's fair. Always has been. Clara turned the ledger around so he could see the columns she'd circled in pencil. 6 years ago, you were paying 11 cents a bushel for grain feed, which was the going rate then. But the going rates dropped twice, since once 4 years back, once again last spring. You're still paying the original price. 11 cents every single order, near 200 bushels a month. Silas did the arithmetic in his head slow and felt his jaw tighten as the number came clear. That's near $40 a month I've been overpaying, for 6 years. Closer to 60 this last year since the price dropped again, and he never adjusted. Clara's mouth was a thin, unhappy line. I'm not saying it was intentional. Man might have just never bothered to update his own pricing, and you never had cause to check. But I'd wager if you rode into town tomorrow and asked around, you'd find every other rancher in the valley's getting a fairer rate than you are, and has been for years. Silas sat back in his chair, running a hand down his face, feeling something close to fury and something close to gratitude fighting for the same space in his chest. 6 years, he said again, quieter. How does a man run a ranch this size and not catch something sitting right in front of him for 6 years? Because he trusts the people around him to be honest, Clara said. And most days that trust is well placed. It's only the days it isn't that cost you. You found it in 2 weeks. I had motivation. She held his gaze steady. Nobody handed me anything my whole life, Mr. Whitaker. Man teaches himself to count every penny twice when he's never had a third one to spare. It was the irrigation ditches she found next, a few days after walking the property with Tom Riggins at her insistence, because she wanted to see the operation with her own eyes rather than trust it to a column of numbers. "This channel's losing water," she said, standing at the edge of a runoff ditch that fed the west pasture, watching a slow, steady seep darken the ground along one bank. "Look how the grass grows thicker here than it does downstream. Water's escaping before it ever reaches where it's meant to go." "Ditch has always run like that," Tom said. "Long as I've worked here." "Then it's always been wasting water long as you've worked here." Clara crouched down, examined the bank, the crumbling earth. "This needs shoring up. Clay lining packed earth, something to seal it. You're losing enough water here to feed another 20 acres easy, and in a dry year, that's the difference between a good harvest and a bad one." Tom looked at her the way a man looks at something he's underestimated badly enough to feel a little ashamed of it. "Ma'am, where'd you learn all this?" "Same place I learned everything," Clara said, standing brushing dirt from her skirt. "Not having a choice but to figure it out myself." By the time she'd finished her walk of the property, she had a list, 3 pages long. Inefficiencies, small wastes, careless habits built up over years by men who'd never had reason to look closely, because the ranch had always been prosperous enough to absorb the losses without anyone noticing. None of it was catastrophic on its own. All of it together added up to a ranch bleeding money slow and steady, the way a man bleeds from a wound too small to feel until he stands up too fast and the world goes gray. Silas read her list that night at the kitchen table in near silence, and when he finished, he set it down carefully, like it was something fragile. "You've done more for this ranch in 2 weeks," he said, "than I managed to notice in 6 years of running it myself." "You were too close to it," Clara said. "That's not a fault, Mr. Whitaker. That's just what happens when a thing is yours. You stop seeing the cracks because you're too busy holding the whole of it up." "Silas," he said. She looked up startled by the correction. "You called me Silas the other night when you found the feed mistake. I liked hearing it." His voice had gone quiet, almost careful in a way she hadn't heard from him before. "Wouldn't mind hearing it more often." Something passed between them then, brief and unspoken, and Clara looked back down at her ledger a beat too quickly, though the corner of her mouth had curved up soft before she did. "Silas," she said again, testing the shape of it. "All right then." Saturday brought market day, and with it the first real test of whether Red Creek Valley meant to forgive Clara Bennett for the sin of surviving. She rode into town beside Silas on the wagon bench, chin up, wearing a dress Mrs. Odom had let out at the seams to fit her proper instead of the borrowed one, 2 sizes too small, and she felt every eye on the street find her and stay there a beat too long. "Don't mind them," Silas said low as he set the brake outside the mercantile. "I don't," Clara said, though her hands were folded a little too tight in her lap to make the claim entirely convincing. Inside, old Mrs. Pruitt was arguing with the store clerk over a sack of cornmeal she swore had come up short on weight 3 times running, and the clerk was doing his level best to talk her out of counting it herself. "I've weighed it twice, Mrs. Pruitt, it's a full sack. I've been buying cornmeal from this store 40 years, young man, and I know the heft of a full sack, same as I know my own name." Clara crossed the store before she'd quite decided to the same way she'd crossed the Whitaker yard to face down Margaret Holloway. "Might I have a look?" she asked. "I've got a fair hand with a scale." The clerk hesitated, glanced toward Silas standing in the doorway, and apparently decided the Whitaker name carried enough weight to grant the request. Clara hefted the sack, checked the store's scale against her own sense of it, then asked politely but firmly to see the weights themselves. She found it in under a minute, a thumb's worth of wax pressed into the underside of the counterweight, just enough to throw every measurement short by a fraction. Small enough nobody would ever think to question it, steady enough to add up to real money over the course of a year, spread thin across every customer who walked through the door. "There's your answer, Mrs. Pruitt," Clara said, holding up the weight so the old woman could see the wax for herself. "Somebody's been shorting this whole town a little at a time. Probably so slow nobody noticed before now." The store went dead quiet. The clerk's face had gone the color of curdled milk. I didn't. That's not the scale must have come from the supplier that way. I never... Then I'd wager the supplier owes this town an apology, and every customer he's shorted these past months owes him nothing further, Clara said, not unkindly setting the weight down on the counter. Might be worth checking your other scales too before word gets round and folks start taking their business elsewhere. Mrs. Pruitt got her cornmeal full weight, plus an extra half sack the clerk pressed on her, with an apology he could barely get out fast enough. And by the time Clara and Silas left the mercantile an hour later, 3 other women had stopped Clara on the boardwalk to ask quietly whether she might take a look at their own household accounts sometime on account of nobody in the valley seeming to have her particular gift for catching what everybody else missed. Seems the valley's warming to you, Silas said, helping her up onto the wagon bench, something like pride sitting plain on his face. Seems the valley's warming to what I can do for them, Clara said. That's not quite the same thing as warming to me, but I'll take what I can get. Give it time, Silas said. The rest'll follow. The trouble started as trouble in Red Creek Valley always seemed to start with Margaret Holloway deciding she wasn't finished. She arrived at the Whitaker Ranch unannounced on a bright, cold Sunday afternoon. 3 weeks after the dinner that never became an engagement, dressed in a traveling gown, too fine for a simple visit, and flanked by her father and 2 of her Holloway cousins, the whole procession rolling up the drive in a carriage polished to catch the sun. Silas met them in the yard, Tom at his shoulder, and did not invite them inside. Margaret, I've come to speak with you about a matter of some delicacy, Margaret said, chin high, voice pitched to carry loud enough Clara realized later hanging back near the kitchen door, with a basin of wash water forgotten in her hands, to be heard by every ranch hand within earshot. I understand you've been keeping a woman here, under your roof, unmarried, unchaperoned. Miss Bennett is a guest and lately an employee. She keeps my books and runs my household better than it's been run in years. She's a fat orphan you found in a snowbank, Margaret said, and the words came out sharp enough to draw blood. And you have humiliated me in front of this entire valley to keep her here. Do you have any idea what people are saying? What they're saying about you choosing a woman like that over everything I could have offered you. Clara set the basin down. She walked out into the yard before she'd fully decided to, before Silas could open his mouth to answer, because some fights a person has to fight themselves, or the answering never means as much. Miss Holloway, Clara said, and her voice did not shake, though her hands tucked into her apron had curled into fists. I know exactly what you think you see when you look at me. Big woman. No family name worth speaking of. No money, no land, no fine gown to wear to a dinner I wasn't even invited to. You're not wrong about any of that. Margaret's eyes narrowed, clearly braced for an argument she thought she already knew the shape of. But I'll tell you what I see when I look at you, Clara went on. A woman who came here to fight over a man like he's a piece of land to be claimed, instead of asking herself why he walked away from you in the first place. You're standing in his yard talking about my size and my name, and you haven't once asked yourself what it was you never gave him that made a half-dead stranger in a snowbank look like a better bargain than everything your family's fortune could buy. The yard had gone very quiet. Even the horses seemed to be listening. How dare you? Margaret managed. I dare, Clara said, because I've got nothing left to lose that you could take from me. That's the difference between us, Miss Holloway. You're afraid of losing something. I already lost everything, and I'm still standing here. That kind of afraid doesn't scare me anymore. Randall Holloway stepped forward, then faced Thunderous, clearly intending to put an end to the exchange with the full weight of his name behind him. But Silas moved first, putting himself quiet and immovable between his yard and the Holloway carriage. I believe you've said what you came to say, Silas said. Margaret, Randall, I wish you both well, but this conversation's finished. You'll regret this, Whitaker. Randall said the same threat he'd made 3 weeks prior, though it landed with considerably less weight the second time around. Amos Cole holds paper on half this valley. You'd do well to remember who your friends are. I know exactly who my friends are, Silas said, standing right here in this yard as it happens. Good day to you. The Holloway carriage pulled away in a spray of gravel, and the ranch hands who'd gathered to watch pretending badly to be occupied with chores that had suddenly required their full attention, let out a breath that seemed to move through the whole yard at once. Tom Riggins was the first to break the silence, tipping his hat toward Clara with an expression that had shed the last of its doubt somewhere in the last 5 minutes. "Ma'am," he said, "I don't believe I've ever seen Margaret Holloway at a loss for words before." "Wasn't trying to silence her," Clara said, though her hands were still trembling now that the moment had passed and left her alone with the size of what she'd just done. "Just trying to tell the truth." "Well," Tom said, "it worked." That evening, Silas found her out by the horse pens watching the sun go down behind the ridge arms wrapped around herself against the evening chill. "You didn't have to do that," he said, coming to stand beside her close, but not too close. "Take her on like that. I could have handled Margaret Holloway myself." "I know you could have." Clara didn't look away from the horizon. "But she was talking about me like I wasn't standing right there to answer for myself. I've spent my whole life letting people talk about me that way, Silas. Letting them decide what I was worth before I ever got the chance to prove different. I'm done doing that." "For what it's worth," Silas said, "I never once thought less of you for your size. Not from the first night I found you." "I know that now." Something in her voice had gone soft, unguarded, in a way it rarely did. "Took me a while to believe it, though. Man in your position, taking in a woman like me, half of me, kept waiting for the day you'd wake up and realize what everyone else already thought they knew. That day's not coming." "No," Clara said, and finally turned to look at him, something steady and searching in her eyes. "I don't believe it is." They stood there a long moment, the last light going gold and then gray over the ridge close enough that Silas could feel the warmth coming off her, despite the cold settling in. And for the first time in 3 years, he did not feel the old familiar wariness that had kept him at arm's length from every woman the valley had ever paraded in front of him. He felt instead something that scared him a good deal more, because it asked nothing of him and wanted nothing from his land or his name. And he had absolutely no idea what to do with a feeling that simple. "Clara." "Yes." He didn't finish the thought, not that night. But she must have heard something in the way he said her name, because she didn't press him for the rest of it. Only reached out, hesitant, and let her hand rest against his arm for a moment, before she drew it back like she was testing whether the warmth between them was real, or only something the cold evening had conjured up between two lonely people standing too close together. It was 2 nights later, over a supper gone cold on the table, because neither of them had thought to eat while they talked, that Clara finally told him about her father. "His name was Joseph," she said, turning a fork over and over between her fingers instead of eating with it. "Joseph Bennett. He ran 300 acres out past Miller's Creek, good land, better cattle than most men twice his size could manage. My mother died when I was 12, and after that it was just the two of us, and he never once made me feel like a burden for it, even though I know now I must have been one some years when the harvest was thin." "You weren't a burden. I was 13 years old and I could barely reach the top shelf of the pantry, Silas. I was a mouth to feed, same as any other, and my father fed me anyway, every single day, without ever once making me feel the weight of it." Clara set the fork down. "He borrowed against the land twice when I was young once for a bad drought year once to buy breeding stock that would have doubled our herd inside 3 seasons. Both loans through Coles Bank, same as every rancher in this valley, eventually borrows through Coles Bank, because there isn't another one for 40 miles. And he paid them back. He paid the first one back in full 2 years early, with interest Cole hadn't even asked for." Something hard had crept into Clara's voice now, old grief worn smooth at the edges, but not gone, never gone. "The second loan he was 3 payments from finishing when he took sick. Influenza the winter I turned 24. Took him inside of 10 days. I buried him myself near enough the neighbors helped dig, but I was the one who had to decide what went in the ground with him, because there wasn't anybody else left who had the right to decide." Silas reached across the table slow and covered her hand with his own. She let him. "Cole came calling within the month," Clara went on. Told me the loan was due in full on account of my father's passing some clause about the borrower's death accelerating the debt that I'd never heard him mention in 6 years of payments. I asked to see the paperwork. He told me a woman had no business questioning a legal contract. I asked again anyway, and he told me if I pushed the matter, he'd see to it the debt collected everything my father owned, instead of just the land down to the furniture and the tools and the last of the winter stores. I had nowhere else to go and nobody left to ask for help. So I signed what he put in front of me, and by spring the land was his. And I was walking to Miller's Creek Township with what I could carry on my back. That's not legal, Silas said. Quiet, careful. The same cold certainty from Cole's letter rising up in him now with a name and a face attached to it. A death doesn't accelerate a debt like that. Not without the clause being written plain into the original note, and even then a widow or an heir's got rights. A bank can't just walk over because there's nobody left to argue. I didn't know that then. I was 24 and burying my father and scared half out of my mind, and Amos Cole has made a career out of finding people in exactly that condition and taking what he wants before they've got the strength left to fight him on it. Clara's eyes had gone bright, but her voice stayed level. The voice of a woman who had cried this story out long ago and had nothing left now but the plain, hard shape of it. I spent the better part of a year moving between whatever work I could find, laundry mending a season, keeping house for a family 2 counties over, who let me go when their circumstances changed. I was making my way back toward Miller's Creek, thinking I might find some kind of work I recognized when the weather turned on me quicker than I'd planned for. And I found that cabin, and then I found you. Or you found me. I still haven't decided which. Both, I'd say. Silas's hand tightened over hers. Clara, that land was never legally Cole's to take. Not if what you're telling me is true, and I don't doubt a word of it. Doesn't much matter now. It's been 3 years. He's got the deed, he's got the paper, and I've got nothing but my own memory of a conversation nobody else was there to witness. Memory's a start, Silas said. I've got a lawyer in the territorial capital who owes me a favor or 3. Man doesn't take kindly to bankers who cheat widows and orphans out of what's rightfully theirs, and neither do I. Clara looked at him for a long moment, something cautious and hoping in equal measure moving behind her eyes, an expression Silas was beginning to recognize as the particular look of a woman who had been disappointed too many times to trust hope easily, and was trying to let herself trust it anyway. Why would you go to that kind of trouble, she asked, over land that isn't even yours to gain from? Because it's the right thing to do, Silas said, and because I care what becomes of the woman who owned it. The letter came 4 days later, delivered by a writer Silas didn't recognize, sealed with wax, stamped in a mark he knew all too well. The same mark that appeared on foreclosure notices and land deeds, and every piece of paper that had ever quietly ruined a family in Red Creek Valley, without anyone quite understanding how it had happened until it was already done. Amos Cole's mark. Silas read the letter twice, standing alone in his study, and the second reading didn't make the words sit any easier than the first. Mr. Whitaker, it has come to my attention that you are harboring the Bennett woman on your property. You should know, in the interest of neighborly honesty, that the girl's late father died owing this bank a debt that was never fully settled, secured against property. This bank has since taken possession of through entirely legal means. I would hate for a man of your standing to find himself entangled in a dispute that has nothing to do with him. I trust you understand my meaning. Your friend and neighbor, Amos Cole. Silas set the letter down slow, feeling something cold settle in his chest that had nothing to do with the weather outside. He thought of Clara at the kitchen table each evening, pencil behind her ear, patiently unraveling 6 years of small dishonesties nobody else had thought to look for. He thought of her walking his fields, finding the water his ranch had been losing for longer than he could count. He thought of the way she'd stood in his yard 3 days back and told Margaret Holloway the truth without a single tremor in her voice, though he now understood, holding this letter, that the truth of her own family's ruin was a wound she hadn't yet let him see the full shape of. He thought of the words nobody else had noticed at the time in the letter's careful, threatening phrasing. Entirely legal means. A banker didn't write a line like that, Silas thought, unless he was worried someone might eventually prove otherwise. He folded the letter, tucked it into the drawer of his desk, and did not mention it to Clara that night. Though he watched her a little longer than usual across the kitchen table, watched the careful, patient way she worked through his ledgers with hands that had survived a snowstorm and a childhood. He was only just beginning to understand had cost her far more than she'd yet told him. Whatever Amos Cole was trying to warn him away from Silas Whitaker had already made up his mind. He wasn't backing down from it. Not the ranch, not the Valley's opinion. And not he was coming to understand with a certainty that surprised him more each day, the woman who'd walked out of a snowstorm and straight into the center of his life without ever once asking him for anything at all. Clara noticed the change in him before she understood the reason for it. He'd gone quiet at supper 3 nights running, the kind of quiet that wasn't peaceful so much as occupied a man turning something over in his mind and not liking the shape of it, no matter which way he turned it. She'd asked him twice what was troubling him. Twice he'd told her it was nothing ranch business, and twice she'd let it drop because she understood better than most people the particular pride of a man who wanted to carry a burden alone until he'd figured out how heavy it truly was. She found the letter on the 4th night, not by searching for it, but because Silas had left his study door open while he went to check on a mare close to foaling, and the drawer of his desk had not latched all the way shut, and the wax seal caught the lamplight when she passed by close enough to notice it. She knew that mark. She would know it if she were blind and only felt it under her fingers. Clara stood in the doorway a long moment, telling herself it wasn't her place to go through a man's private correspondence. And then she thought of her father's coffin and the year she'd spent walking from one strange kitchen to the next, with nothing but a carpet bag to her name, and she decided some things mattered more than manners. She read it twice, same as Silas had. She was still holding it when he came back in. Clara, you knew. Her voice came out steadier than she felt, which was its own small miracle, considering the ground had just dropped out from under her for the 2nd time in her life. 4 days, Silas. You've had this 4 days, and you didn't say one word. I was going to tell you, when after Cole had already ridden out here and said whatever he came to say, after you'd already decided for yourself how much of it I could handle hearing. She set the letter down on the desk, careful though her hands wanted to crumple it into nothing. I told you about my father. I told you the whole of it, the parts that still keep me up some nights, and you sat there and let me pour it all out, and never once mentioned you were already holding a threat with his name signed at the bottom. I didn't want to give you one more thing to carry before I knew what it meant. That's not your decision to make. Clara's chin was up, the same stubborn set to it she'd worn facing down Margaret Holloway in the yard, except this time the fight in her eyes had a different target. I have spent 3 years with people deciding what I could handle without ever once asking me. My father. God rest him, deciding I was too young to know how bad the drought years were. Cole deciding a grieving woman had no business seeing her own family's paperwork. I thought you were different, Silas. I thought you of all people understood what it costs a person to be protected right out of the truth. Silas crossed the room and stood close enough that she had to tip her head back to hold his gaze, and when he spoke, his voice had none of the careful gentleness he'd used on her that first dawn in the Holloway parlor. It was rougher now, more honest for it. You're right, he said. I was wrong to sit on it. I've spent so long being the man who handles things alone, I forgot there's a difference between protecting somebody and shutting them out. Won't happen again. You have my word. The fight went out of her slow, the way a fire banks down instead of dying all at once. I want to see everything, Clara said. Every letter he sends, every piece of paper with his mark on it. If Amos Cole means to come after this ranch the way he came after my father's, I mean to be standing right beside you when he tries it, not tucked away somewhere being kept safe from my own fight. All right, Silas said. Everything. I promise you that much. Cole came calling himself 6 days later, and he did not come alone. He rode up the drive, flanked by 2 men Silas didn't recognize, hired muscle dressed up in decent coats to look like clerks, instead of what they plainly were, and Amos Cole himself sat his horse like a man who'd never once in his life doubted he'd get exactly what he came for. Whitaker. Cole didn't dismount. He had a way of talking down at a man from horseback that Silas suspected he'd practiced, same as Margaret Holloway practiced her smiles. "Fine spread you've got here. Shame it's carrying more debt than folks realize." "I don't carry debt with your bank, Cole. Never have." "No?" Cole agreed, pleasant as poison, you don't. But your neighbor to the east does, and the water rights on this whole stretch of Red Creek run through an agreement your daddy signed 30 years back before either of us were old enough to shave. Agreement's got some language in it that's due for review. Might be worth your while to come discuss it in town before somebody less friendly than me decides to read it first. That agreement's been settled law for 30 years. Laws get reinterpreted, Cole said. Especially when the man doing the interpreting owes the bank a favor or two. "Which judge is that?" Silas said. "I'd like a name, seeing as you're so confident in this reinterpretation of yours." Something flickered across Cole's face, brief, and irritated the look of a man unaccustomed to being asked to show his hand before he was ready. "You'll know soon enough. Territorial court moves slow, but it moves. I'd advise you spend the time between now and then thinking hard on what you stand to lose fighting a claim you can't win, instead of wasting good money on a lawyer who'll tell you the same thing I'm telling you for free." "Funny," Silas said. "Every time you've come to warn a man about wasting money on a lawyer, it's turned out he needed one worse than he thought." His eyes slid past Silas toward the porch where Clara had come to stand with her arms crossed, unmoving, unflinching under the weight of his stare. "Miss Bennett, you're looking well. Considerably better than the last time I laid eyes on you out at your daddy's place, signing those papers with your hand shaking so bad I had to guide the pen myself." "I remember it different," Clara said. "I remember you telling a grieving woman she had no right to question a contract, and then making certain she signed before she'd had time to think twice." "I remember doing my job," Cole said, unbothered. "Banking's not a kind business, Miss Bennett. Never claimed it was. Fraud isn't a business at all," Clara said. "It's a crime. And someday soon, somebody with the standing to make you answer for it is going to say so out loud in front of a judge instead of a kitchen table." Something flickered behind Cole's eyes, then quick and gone, but Silas caught it and understood in that instant that Clara had landed closer to the truth than either of them had fully realized. "Big talk," Cole said, "from a woman with no deed, no witness, and no family left to back her word against mine." His gaze moved back to Silas, and his voice dropped, losing its pleasant edge entirely. "You do well to remember something, Whitaker. I've been doing business in this valley since before you were old enough to sit a horse alone. Every rancher who's ever tried to fight me in a courtroom has come away with less than he started with. Every single one. I'd hate to add your name to that particular list on account of a debt that isn't even yours to fight." "Then I suppose we'll be the first," Silas said. Cole studied him a long moment, something calculating moving behind his eyes, and then he smiled thin and unhurried, the smile of a man who had never once in his career been forced to consider losing. "We'll see, won't we?" He gathered his reins, turned his horse toward the drive. "You think on that water agreement, Whitaker? I'd hate to see a prosperous man lose everything his family built over a debt that isn't even his to fight." He rode off with his 2 hired men trailing behind him, and Silas stood in his own yard, feeling the particular cold that comes from realizing a fight has just gotten a great deal bigger than the 2 people standing in it. The fence came down 3 nights later. Tom Riggins woke Silas before dawn, pounding on the front door, breath fogging hard in the cold 20 head of cattle already scattered across 2 miles of open range, by the time anyone had noticed the north pasture gate hanging wide open on a hinge that had been cut clean through with a blade not worn loose by time or weather. "Wasn't an accident," Tom said, holding the severed hinge up for Silas to see. "Somebody did this on purpose, and did it quiet enough nobody heard a thing. Cole's men. Can't prove it, but I'd bet my saddle on it." They spent the better part of 2 days rounding up scattered cattle across country, turned mean and unforgiving with the season's first real freeze, and Clara rode out with them. Despite Silas's protest, sitting a horse with more skill than he'd expected from a woman who'd spent the last 3 years on foot more often than not. "My father taught me to ride before he taught me to read," she told him when he raised an eyebrow at how easy she sat the saddle. "Some things a person doesn't forget no matter how many years pass between." They found the last of the herd bunched up against a dry wash as the light was failing, and Clara was the one who spotted the second cut fence line a half-mile further on this one along the property boundary itself, deliberate as the first. "He's not just scattering cattle," she said, staring at the severed wire, understanding arriving cold and sudden. "He's testing you, seeing how much trouble he can cause before you come running to his office begging to settle that water agreement on his terms. Then he's about to learn I don't scare that easy." "No," Clara agreed. "But he might not need you to scare. He might just need you distracted and tired and bleeding money on repairs and lost stock until you're desperate enough to sign whatever he puts in front of you just to make the trouble stop. That's how he got my father's land. Not all at once. A little at a time until there was nothing left to fight with." Silas looked at her a long moment in the dying light, cold, settling into his bones, and felt something harden in his chest that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Then we don't let him wear us down," he said. "We beat him to it." He rode into town the next morning and sent a telegram to the lawyer in the territorial capital, a man named Ezra Colton, who'd handled a cattle dispute for Silas's father years back and still owed the Whitaker name a favor worth calling in. The answer came back 2 days later, and it was not the answer Silas had been hoping for. "Water rights review hearing set. Stop, 30 days from notice. Stop. Judge presiding is Harlan Voss. Stop. Voss holds paper with Cole Bank. Personally, stop. Recommend strongest evidence possible. Stop, will travel for hearing. Stop." Silas read the telegram twice, standing in the dusty front room of the territorial office, feeling the walls of the trap Cole had built draw a fraction tighter. 30 days, he told Clara that evening, laying the telegram flat on the kitchen table between them. "And the judge hearing the case owes Cole money." "Then 30 days isn't a deadline," Clara said, already reaching for a stub of pencil, already thinking faster than her hand could keep pace with. "It's a countdown. And we'd best start moving faster than we have been, because a rigged judge doesn't need good evidence to rule against us. He only needs an excuse, and Cole's the kind of man who'll hand him one wrapped up neat if we give him the time to build it. We need proof he's done this before, more than just what happened to your father." "Then that's where we start looking," Clara said. The trouble in town started the same week, and it wore Margaret Holloway's face, though Clara suspected rightly that the woman herself was only a tool being used by hands more patient than her own. It began small. A whisper here, a raised eyebrow there. By the time Clara rode into Red Creek for supplies that Saturday, the warmth she'd earned at the Mercantile weeks before had curdled into something cold or watchful. A handful of women who'd once asked her to look over their household accounts, now finding reasons to be occupied elsewhere when she passed. "Heard you've got Amos Cole asking questions about you," Ruth Anders said quiet over the counter at the post office, glancing toward the door like she wanted to make sure nobody was listening. "Heard Margaret Holloway's been telling anyone who'll stand still that you're some kind of confidence woman working an angle on Whitaker, same as you must have worked one on your own father's estate, whatever that's supposed to mean. It means Cole's trying to make sure that if I ever stand up in front of a judge, nobody in this valley will believe a word I say." Clara kept her voice level, though something cold moved through her at the confirmation of what she'd already suspected. "He's not just threatening Silas's ranch, Ruth. He's poisoning the well before I've even had the chance to draw water from it." "Is it true, though, what he took from your family?" "Every word," Clara said. "And I mean to prove it one way or another if it's the last thing I do in this valley." Ruth studied her a long moment, weighing something, and then reached under the counter and slid a small bundle of yellowed papers across the wood between them. "My husband clerked for the old land office before Cole's bank bought most of the county records off the territory," Ruth said low. "Kept copies of things he thought might matter someday on account of some of what came through that office never sat right with him. I don't know if there's anything useful in there, but I know your father's name is in it somewhere, and I know it's better in your hands than sitting in a drawer collecting dust till I'm too old to remember why I kept it." Clara's hands were shaking when she took the bundle. "Why are you helping me?" "Because my husband died believing this town owed somebody an apology. It never paid," Ruth said. "And because you stood in that mercantile and caught a cheat nobody else bothered looking for and didn't ask for a single thing in return for it. Man like Cole's been getting away with this valley's trust for 15 years. Might be time somebody finally made him answer for it." She read the papers that night by lamplight at the kitchen table. Silas across from her, both of them working in a silence too tense to call comfortable, and it was well past midnight when Clara's breath caught hard enough that Silas looked up from his own work to find her staring at a single page like it had reached out and struck her. "Silas? What is it?" "It's not just my father." Her voice had gone strange, tight disbelief and fury braiding together into something neither emotion alone could account for. "There's a list here. Names, dates, loan amounts, every one of them. The same pattern a rancher borrows against his land, pays faithful for years. Then, something happens. A death, or a bad season, or an accident. And suddenly, there's a clause nobody remembers signing that lets Cole call the whole debt due at once. 6 names. Silas. 6 families in this valley, going back 12 years, and every single one of them lost everything inside a year of that clause getting invoked. Silas came around this table to read over her shoulder and felt the same cold certainty settle into him that had been building since the letter first arrived. "He's been doing this for years," he said, "building himself a fortune off half the ranches in this valley, one grieving family at a time. And nobody's ever caught him at it, because nobody ever had all 6 names in one place before tonight." Clara looked up at him, something fierce and frightened both moving behind her eyes. "This is bigger than my father's land, Silas. This is bigger than your water rights. If I take this in front of a judge, I'm not just fighting for what Cole stole from me. I'm fighting for every family he's ruined, and every family he means to ruin next." Then we take it to the judge. It's not that simple. Ruth's husband kept these because something didn't sit right with him, but they're not proof, not on their own. I need somebody who signed one of those original notes and lived to say out loud that the clause wasn't there when they put their name on the page. I need a witness, Silas, not just a list of names on old paper. Then we find one. Tomorrow, first light. We start with whoever's closest. And if Cole gets word of what we're doing before we do... Clara's voice had dropped, and for the first time since Silas had known her, he heard real fear in it, not for herself, but for what a man like Cole might do, once he understood the ground had shifted beneath him. A man who's built an empire on ruining grieving families isn't going to sit quiet while somebody threatens to take it all away. You saw what he did to your fence line, just for asking a few questions. What do you suppose he'll do once he knows we've got proof of 6 frauds instead of 1? Silas didn't have an answer for that. Not one that made either of them feel any safer. The Sorensen place sat 8 miles north, a modest spread that had once run 400 head of cattle, and now, by the look of the thinned-out herd, grazing what remained of the pasture, ran considerably fewer. Amos Sorensen himself came out to meet them at the gate, a broad, weathered man with a wariness in his eyes that softened only slightly at the sight of Clara. "Bennett girl," he said. "Been a long while." "Mr. Sorensen." Clara's voice had gone gentle, in a way Silas hadn't heard from her before, careful like she was approaching another wounded animal in a snowbank. "I expect you heard what happened to my father's place. Heard and never forgot it." Sorensen's jaw tightened. "Same thing near happened to mine 3 years back. Different circumstance. My boy took sick, not me but Cole, found his claws all the same, called the note due when I was too busy nursing a dying child to fight him proper. I managed to keep the house and 40 acres by selling off most the herd and every piece of jewelry my wife owned. Man still holds paper on what's left. I'm asking you to testify," Clara said. Plain, no softening the size of the request. "Judge Voss is hearing a water rights case in less than 30 days, that Cole means to use to take Whitaker land the same way he took ours. If you'll stand up and say out loud what that clause really was, and how it appeared in your note after the fact, it might be enough to crack this whole thing open." Sorensen's face had gone the color of old ash. "Judge Voss holds paper with Cole's bank, too. Man testifies against Amos Cole in that man's own courtroom. He's not fighting for justice, Miss Bennett. He's fighting to keep the roof over his family's head, and odds are he loses both. I understand the risk. Do you? You've got nothing left for him to take. I've got a wife and a boy who's finally healthy again, and 40 acres. That's the only thing standing between my family and nothing at all." Sorensen looked away toward the thin cattle grazing what remained of his land, shame and fear, both plain on his weathered face. "I'm sorry for what happened to your daddy. I truly am. But I can't risk what little I've got left standing up against a man who's never once lost a fight in this valley." Clara didn't argue. She only nodded slow, like she'd expected the answer even while hoping for a different one. "If you change your mind," she said, "you know where to find me." They rode away in silence, and it was a full mile before Clara spoke again, her voice tight with a frustration she was clearly working hard to keep from turning into despair. "That's the trouble with a man like Cole," she said. "He doesn't just take what people have. He teaches them to be afraid of losing what little he leaves them until fear does half his work for him, and he never even has to lift a finger." "5 more names on that list," Silas said. "Then we'd best hope the next one's got more to lose by staying silent than by speaking up." Tom Riggins saw them together 2 days later and rode straight back to the ranch to say so, dust still thick on his coat from the hard ride. "Margaret Holloway," he said, breathless, finding Silas out by the rebuilt fence line. Out past the old mill road, meeting with Cole himself, the two of them talking close enough I couldn't make out words, but close enough there wasn't any mistaking what kind of meeting it was. Wasn't a chance encounter, boss. She was waiting on him. Had a basket of letters with her, handed the whole bundle over before I got close enough to see more. Letters. Couldn't say what was in them, but I'd wager good money it wasn't love notes, seeing as Cole tucked them straight into his saddlebag and rode off without so much as a tip of his hat. Silas found Clara in the kitchen garden that evening and told her what Tom had seen, and watched her face go through fear and fury. And finally, a grim kind of understanding that settled somewhere past both. "She's feeding him information," Clara said. "Everything the valley says about me, everything Margaret's heard whispered at church socials and quilting circles, handed straight to the one man who can use it best. He's not just building a case against your water rights, Silas. He's building one against my character, so that when I finally do stand up in that courtroom, Judge Voss has got a folder full of gossip to wave in my face before I've said a single word in my own defense. Then we make sure the truth gets there first." "The truth's harder to hand a judge than a bundle of letters," Clara said. "Rumor spreads faster than fact ever has. Always has, always will. Cole knows that better than anyone in this valley, and he's using Margaret Holloway's wounded pride to do the spreading for him, and I doubt she's even smart enough to realize she's being used same as the rest of us." "Time's getting shorter," Silas said, quiet, watching the last light fail over the ridge. "Feels shorter every hour." The barn caught fire 4 nights later. Clara woke to the smell of smoke thick enough to choke on, and Silas already gone from the house boots pounding across the yard toward a wall of orange light climbing up into the black sky where the hay barn stood. And she was out the door and running before her mind had fully caught up with what her body already understood. "Clara, stay back. I'm not staying anywhere while that barn burns with half your winter feed inside it." She was already at the pump, working the handle with both hands, shouting orders at ranch hands, stumbling half-dressed out of the bunkhouse, and something in the clear, steady certainty of her voice cut through the panic better than Silas's own shouting had managed. "Bucket line now from the pump to the trough to the fire. Everybody in a line, don't break it for anything. Tom, get the horses out of the near pen that wind's carrying sparks straight toward them. Silas. Here. The irrigation channel runs behind the barn, the one I had you shore up last month. If we can cut a breach in the bank, we can flood the low side and keep it from spreading to the bunkhouse." They fought the fire for 3 hours. The whole ranch turned out in the freezing dark, faces black with smoke, hands blistered from bucket handles and shovel work. And when the last of the flames finally guttered down to smoking char, They'd lost the barn and a third of the winter hay. But the bunkhouse stood, and every soul on the property stood with it, exhausted and alive. It was Tom Riggins who found the empty coal oil tin half buried at the tree line beyond the north pasture, still smelling of kerosene, tossed aside by somebody who hadn't much cared whether it was found or not. "Wasn't lightning," Tom said, grim, holding the tin up in the gray dawn light. "Wasn't careless hands either. Somebody set that fire on purpose, boss, and didn't even bother hiding how they did it." "Sending a message," Silas said. "Then he sent it," Clara said, standing beside him, soot streaked across her face. Exhaustion and fury both burning steady behind her eyes. And he's about to get an answer he isn't expecting. They sat up the rest of that night in the kitchen, too wound up from the fire to sleep, hands wrapped around cups of coffee, gone cold and forgotten. And it was somewhere in the small hours, with the whole ranch finally quiet around them, and the smell of smoke still clinging to both their clothes, that Silas reached across the table and took her hand. And this time, neither one of them pretended it was only comfort. "I keep thinking," he said, "about the night I found you in that snowbank. Half of me still can't believe how close I came to losing you before I ever really had the chance to know you." "You didn't lose me." "No. But I keep thinking on it anyway. What this ranch would look like tonight if I'd stayed at that dinner table instead of walking out into the storm. What kind of life I'd be living, married to a woman who never once looked at me like she saw anything worth keeping besides my land." "You'd be a wealthy man with an empty house," Clara said quiet. "I've seen enough of those in my life to know the shape of it. I don't want that life. Haven't wanted it in a long while, if I'm honest. Though I didn't have the words for what I was missing until you were sitting across this table calling me out for hiding a letter from you." His thumb moved slow across her knuckles, careful of the blisters still raw from the bucket line. "Clara, whatever Cole throws at us next, fire or fraud or every lawyer money can buy, I need you to know I'm not fighting this to save my ranch. I'm fighting it because the woman sitting across from me right now matters more to me than every acre I own. And I'll be damned if I let a man like Amos Cole take one more thing from you that he's got no right to." Clara's eyes had gone bright, and for once, she didn't try to hide it. Didn't reach for the steady composure she wore like armor in front of everyone else in the valley. "Nobody's ever said anything like that to me," she said, "and meant it the way you just did." "Then it was past time somebody did," Silas said, echoing words he'd spoken to her weeks before, and this time, when he leaned across the table, she met him halfway, and the kiss that followed carried in it every hard mile. Both of them had walked to arrive at this one small, steady moment of warmth in a kitchen that still smelled of smoke and ash, and underneath it, something that finally smelled like hope. Dawn found them both still at the table, the fresh scars of the night's fire still smoking somewhere out past the window, and Clara reached for a stub of pencil and began writing again, steadier now than she'd been in weeks. "Sorensen's afraid. Fine, he's not the only name left." She underlined something on the page hard enough the pencil nearly tore through. "There's a family past the Miller's Creek crossing. Ruth mentioned might still be in the valley. And a woman in town whose husband's name is on that list, dead 2 years now, which means she's got even less left for Cole to threaten her with than I do. Then we ride out to her next." "We ride out to all of them," Clara said, steel back in her voice. The fire and the fear of the night before burned down now into something harder and more purposeful. "Every single name on this list, until somebody finally decides they've got more to gain from telling the truth than they've got to lose." Silas looked at the list at the woman who'd built it out of grief and stubbornness, and a mind sharper than any banker in the territory, and felt something settle in him that had been unsteady since the night that letter first arrived. "Then we start today," he said. "We ride out and we ask, and we don't stop asking till somebody finally tells the truth out loud." Outside, the last of the smoke from the burned barn still hung low over the yard, gray and stubborn against a sky just beginning to lighten. And somewhere beyond the ridge, in a town that had spent 15 years too frightened or too comfortable to ask hard questions. Of the man who held its paper, Amos Cole was about to learn that the woman he'd once told to sign without reading had finally found her voice and did not intend to lower it again. Hattie Marsh lived alone in a two-room house at the edge of town, the kind of modest place a woman ends up in after a husband dies owing more than he owned, and she opened her door to Clara and Silas with the particular caution of somebody who had long ago stopped expecting good news to come knocking. "Bennett girl," she said, same as Sorensen, had like the valley had never quite let Clara grow past the name her father gave her. "And Mr. Whitaker. Don't imagine you've come calling for the pleasure of my company." "No, ma'am," Clara admitted. "We've come about your husband's note, about the clause Cole used to take everything after he passed." Something in Hattie Marsh's face went very still, and for a moment Clara feared she'd read the woman wrong entirely, that grief had calcified into the same fear that had turned Sorensen away at his own gate. Then Hattie stepped back from the door and let them in. "Sit," she said. "Coffee's weak on account of I ration the grounds now, but you're welcome to it." She told the story plain without embellishment. The way a person tells something they've turned over in their mind so many times, it's worn smooth of any drama it might once have carried. Her husband Elias had borrowed against their small spread to cover a bad winter, same as half the valley had at one point or another. He'd died of a heart seizure hauling feed 2 years back quick and without warning, and Cole had ridden out inside the month with papers claiming the note came due in full, on account of a clause neither Hattie nor her husband remembered signing. "I didn't have the strength to fight him," she said. "Buried Elias on a Tuesday, signed away the last of what we'd built together by that Friday. Man doesn't give a widow time to think straight before he wants his signature." "Would you testify to that?" Clara asked. "In front of a judge?" Hattie looked at her a long moment, and something hardened behind her tired eyes. "I've got nothing left for that man to take," she said. "Not the way Sorensen does with a family still under his roof. He already took my roof, more or less. I'm renting this house from my own sister now, if you can believe the shame of that. I'll stand up in any courtroom you point me toward and tell the truth. Miss Bennett, and I'll tell it loud enough, Amos Cole hears every word of it." Clara's hands were shaking again when they rode away, though this time it wasn't from cold. "That's 2, she said. 2 of 6, and one of them willing to say it out loud." "It's a start," Silas said. "It's more than a start. It's a crack in the wall he's built around himself for 15 years. Jamais." The Coopers were harder to find, and harder still to convince, once they'd been found, a young couple working a hard-scrabble 40 acres past the North Fork who'd lost the better part of their original spread to Cole 3 years back, and had spent every season since clawing their way back towards something resembling security. "We heard what happened to Sorensen," Ezra Cooper said, standing in his own doorway with his wife close behind him, a baby balanced on her hip and fear plain in both their faces. "Heard Cole's been sending riders out at night to remind folks what standing against him costs. We've got a child now, Miss Bennett. Can't risk what little we've clawed back for a fight that isn't ours to win. It's every family's fight he's ruined," Clara said, though she already understood, watching the baby fuss against her mother's shoulder, that this door would close same as Sorensen's had. "Maybe so. But it's your fight to lose, not ours." Cooper's voice softened, some guilt working behind his eyes. "You find a way to beat him without us standing up first, and I'll shake your hand and thank you for it. But I won't put my boy's roof at risk on a chance, even a chance, I believe in my heart is right." They rode away with 3 names still silent on Clara's list, and she didn't speak again until the Whitaker gate came into view. 3 of 6, she said finally. "Might have to be enough." "It'll be enough," Silas said, though neither of them fully believed it yet. The note was waiting on the kitchen table when they got home, delivered by a rider nobody at the ranch had seen arrive, tucked under the sugar bowl, like whoever left it had walked through the house itself rather than simply knocked at the door. Silas read it once and felt his stomach turn to ice. "Heard you paid a visit to the widow Marsh today. Shame if a lonely woman renting a room from her own kin were to find herself short on charity from that quarter, on account of certain debts her sister's husband carries with my bank. Some people just don't know when to leave well enough alone." "He knows already," Clara said, reading over his shoulder, fury and fear moving through her voice in equal measure. "We were gone 4 hours, Silas. 4 hours, and he already knows exactly where we went and what we said." Somebody's watching the roads. Somebody's watching us. Clara set the note down like it might burn her fingers. And if he can threaten Hattie's own sister to keep her quiet, he can threaten anyone else on that list the same way before we ever get the chance to ask. Randall Holloway arrived at the ranch 3 days later, alone this time without carriage or cousins, or the fine traveling clothes he'd worn the last time he'd stood in Silas's yard. And something in the set of his shoulders told Silas, before he'd said a single word, that the man standing before him now was not the same man who'd threatened him twice already. Whitaker. Randall's voice had lost its bluster. I need to speak with you. Alone, if the Bennett woman doesn't mind. She minds, Silas said. Anything you've got to say you say in front of Clara, or you don't say it at all. Randall's jaw worked old pride wrestling with whatever had brought him out here without an audience for the first time in longer than Silas could remember. Cole came to see me last week, he said finally, about a note I've carried with his bank going on 9 years secured against 40 acres of my western pasture. Told me the terms were due for review, same tune he's apparently been singing to half this valley. Told me if I didn't want trouble, I ought to make certain my daughter kept quiet about whatever business she's been running between his office and mine. Your daughter's been feeding him information, Clara said. We know. I didn't until 3 days back. Something raw moved across Randall's face, humiliation and fear both. Man's been using my own daughter's wounded pride to spy on the two of you, and using my note to keep my mouth shut about it. And I sat in his office and realized I was looking at the same trap I've watched him spring on half a dozen families in this valley over the years, except this time it was my own land sitting in the jaws of it. So you've come to warn us, Silas said, or you've come to beg us to stop before he calls your note due. Both, if I'm honest. Randall met his eyes, and for the first time since the night of the engagement dinner, Silas saw something like respect pass between them. I've spent 15 years telling myself Amos Cole was a hard businessman, not a criminal. Man loaned me money when the bank in the next county turned me away, back when my own father's ranch was failing, and nobody else in the territory would extend a Holloway a dime of credit. I let that gratitude blind me to what he was doing to everyone else who came through his door, without my name behind them. I'm not proud of that, Whitaker. Wish I could say different, but I won't lie to you now, not after everything else I've already lied to myself about. How much do you owe him? Clara asked. Enough that losing it would cost me the western pasture and every head of cattle grazing it. Randall's voice had gone rough. I built half my fortune on Cole's money, Miss Bennett, same as most every rancher in this valley did at one time or another, because there wasn't another bank for 40 miles, and a man can't run cattle without capital to start. I never once asked myself what it cost the families who couldn't pay him back on his terms. Didn't want to know if I'm honest. Easier to look away. What do you want from us, Mr. Holloway? Clara asked, quiet. I want to know if you can win, Randall said. Because if you can, I mean to stand with you when the time comes, note or no note. And if you can't, I need to know that too, so I can decide how much of what's left of my family's name I'm willing to lose trying. Margaret came 2 days after her father unannounced, same as he'd been, and there was nothing left of the fury she'd worn in Silas's yard weeks before. What remained looked more like shame wearing a traveling dress. I brought you something, she told Clara, standing stiff and uncertain on the porch, a small bundle of correspondence clutched against her chest, like she wasn't entirely sure she meant to hand it over even now. Letters. Mine mostly things I wrote Cole about you, about the ranch, about anything I overheard that might make you look like exactly the kind of woman he wanted the judge to believe you were. I've kept copies of what he sent back. Why bring them to me? Because I read one of his replies twice last night and finally understood what my father only just figured out, Margaret said, and her voice cracked on the last word. He never once cared what happened to me, Clara. Not really. I thought all this time I was helping him hurt you, because I wanted Silas back. But reading his own words, I understand now I was never anything to him but a useful pair of ears in the right kitchen. He'd have used anyone. He simply had the good fortune that it was easiest to use me. Clara took the bundle, careful watching Margaret's face for the trap she half expected to find hiding behind this sudden confession. "This isn't an apology," Margaret said before Clara could ask. "I don't imagine you'd believe one from me, even if I offered it, and I'm not entirely sure I'd mean it yet myself. But these letters prove he was building a case against your character months before that hearing was ever scheduled, planning it the same patient, careful way he planned taking your father's land. That has to be worth something to a judge, even a judge in his pocket." "It might be worth everything," Silas said, quiet already, understanding the weight of what Margaret had just handed them. Margaret nodded once sharp and turned to go, then paused at the top of the porch steps. "I hope you win," she said, not looking back. "I hope you take everything from him that he's ever taken from anyone else in this valley. I only wish I'd had the courage to say so before I helped him do it." Ezra Colton arrived from the territorial capital a full week ahead of the hearing. A lean, gray-haired man with tired eyes and the unhurried manner of somebody who had spent 30 years watching powerful men underestimate exactly how much trouble a single stubborn lawyer could cause them. He spread every document across the Whitaker kitchen table the evening he arrived. Ruth's bundle, Margaret's letters, the notes Clara had taken from Hattie Marsh, and the Sorensens and the Coopers alike, and read through the whole of it twice without saying a word, while Silas and Clara sat across from him, feeling the weight of the silence more with every passing minute. "It's good," Colton said finally. "Better than good in places. The pattern across 6 notes is damning on its own, and a signed confession from a man caught stealing evidence on Cole's orders is the kind of thing most judges couldn't ignore, no matter who they owed money to." He tapped the table once hard. "But Judge Voss isn't most judges. I've argued in front of him before. Man's careful he won't rule against the plain evidence outright that would draw too much attention from the territorial bench above him. What he'll do instead is find some technicality to dismiss the water rights claim without ever addressing the fraud evidence at all, and rule the whole matter outside the scope of what he was asked to hear." "Then what good is any of this?" Clara asked, something close to despair creeping into her voice for the first time since Silas had known her. "It's good because we're not going to let him narrow the scope," Colton said. "I mean to walk into that courtroom and put the fraud pattern directly in front of him, sworn testimony and all, whether he wants to hear it or not. A judge can dismiss a claim. It's a good deal harder for him to pretend 6 ruined families never testified to their faces, especially with half the valley likely to be sitting in that gallery, watching him do it." He looked between them steady. "I won't promise you a victory. I've lost cases I should have won, same as any lawyer who's argued long enough. But I'll promise you this. Amos Cole is not going to walk out of that courtroom the same untouchable man he walked in as whatever Voss decides about the water rights themselves." "That has to be enough," Silas said. "For now," Colton agreed. "It usually has to be." The break-in came on the 9th night past midnight, and it was only Clara's habit of sleeping poorly since the fire that woke her to the sound of a floorboard creaking in the study below, a sound that didn't belong to any member of the household she knew. She didn't wake Silas first. She should have. Instead, she was already moving down the hall on bare feet, a heavy iron poker gripped tight in one hand, following the thin sliver of lamplight leaking out from beneath the study door. The man inside had Ruth's bundle of papers half out of the desk drawer when Clara shouldered the door open and swung the poker hard enough to catch him across the shoulder before he'd even fully turned. He went down, cursing, papers scattering across the floor, and Clara was on him before he could recover his feet. One knee planted hard against his chest. The poker raised again when Silas came through the door behind her with a lantern in one hand and a pistol in the other. "Clara, he's got the papers." Her voice was shaking now that the moment had passed enough for fear to catch up with fury. "He was taking the papers, Silas. Everything Ruth gave us, everything we've built these past 2 weeks. I know, I see it." Silas knelt, pressed the pistol close enough to the intruder's temple that the man went still as stone. "Who sent you?" The man said nothing. "Who sent you?" Silas said again, quieter, more dangerous for the quiet. "You've got exactly 1 chance to answer that before I decide you broke into my home, meaning me harm, and I'm within my rights to have treated you accordingly." "Cole." The word came out fast, panicked. Amos Cole sent me. Paid me $20 to take whatever papers I found in this desk and bring them back to him before the hearing. That's all I know, I swear it, man. Didn't tell me what was in them or why he wanted them gone. And the fire, Clara said cold. The barn. Was that you too? That wasn't me. I don't know nothing about a fire. The man's eyes were wide now, genuine fear replacing the panic of a moment before. But I know Cole's had 2 other men riding for him these past weeks, doing jobs he don't want traced back to his own hands. I'm just a man needed the $20, ma'am. I swear before God, that's the whole truth of it. What's your name? Silas said. Dooley. Frank Dooley. Well, Mr. Dooley, you're going to repeat every word of that to a sheriff, and if you're smart, you'll repeat it loud enough that half this valley hears it too, because a confession only protects you so long as it's out in the open where Cole can't quietly make it disappear. Dooley's throat worked. He finds out I talked, he won't just take my wages. He finds out you didn't talk, Clara said. You're looking at a jail cell for breaking into a man's home in the dead of night with no confession to soften the charge. Way I see it, telling the truth is the only card left in your hand worth playing. Tom Riggins arrived at a run, roused by the commotion, and between the 3 of them, they had the intruder bound to a chair by the time the first gray light was creeping through the study window. We ride for the sheriff at first light, Silas said. The sheriff who's likely as beholden to Cole as Judge Voss is, Clara said, weary now, the adrenaline of the fight draining out of her all at once. But we ride for him anyway because a confession's a confession, and even a bought sheriff has to answer for it if enough of the valley is watching when we bring this man in. The town meeting had been called for church business, a discussion of repairs needed on the roof before winter set in proper, and nobody in Red Creek Valley expected it to become anything more than that, until Amos Cole rose from his pew near the front and asked with the easy confidence of a man who had never once considered he might be wrong for a moment to address a matter of some concern to the whole community. There's a woman living out at the Whitaker Ranch, Cole said, who's been telling folks around this valley a story about my bank that isn't true. I've held my tongue about it out of respect for Mr. Whitaker's standing, but I understand she means to bring these accusations before Judge Voss inside the week, and I think this congregation deserves to hear the truth before some outside court hears a pack of lies. Silas was on his feet before Cole had finished the sentence, but it was Clara's hand on his arm that held him still. Let him talk, she said, quiet only for him. Every word he says in front of this whole town is one more thing he'll have to answer for when it's proven false. Cole spun his story smooth and practiced painting Clara as a woman who'd shown up in the valley with nothing, worked her way into a wealthy rancher's good graces, and was now attempting to extort money and land from an honest banker through wild accusations she couldn't possibly prove. He spoke of her father's debt like it had been a simple failure to pay, rather than the calculated theft it truly was, and he watched the congregation as he spoke, gauging which faces still doubted and which had already begun to nod along. It was Hattie Marsh who stood first, rising slow from a back pew where she'd been sitting quiet and unnoticed, and the whole church turned to look at a widow woman nobody had expected to speak. I'll tell you the truth if nobody minds, Hattie said, and her voice, though soft, carried clean through the silent room. Amos Cole took my home 2 years back, same way he took Joseph Bennett's, using a clause that appeared in my husband's note only after Elias was already in the ground and couldn't testify it wasn't there when he signed. I've got nothing left for that man to threaten me with, so I'll say plain what I never had the courage to say before now. Clara Bennett isn't lying. I only wish somebody had believed me sooner, so she wouldn't have had to be the one brave enough to make me finally speak. The church had gone dead silent. Cole's easy composure cracked for just a moment, quick and gone, but Silas caught it, same as he'd caught it in the yard weeks before, and understood that the crack was only going to widen from here. One bitter widow's word against 15 years of honest business, Cole said, recovering though his voice had lost some of its earlier smoothness. Grief makes people remember things that never happened. Then explain the confession, Silas said, standing now unwilling to stay quiet a moment longer. Explain the man we caught in my own study 9 nights back, tied up right now in my barn, who's already told the sheriff you paid him $20 to steal evidence before this very hearing. Explain that Cole in front of this whole congregation, same as you've asked Clara to explain herself." Ezra Colton rose from the pew beside Silas, unhurried, letting the silence stretch a moment before he spoke. The practiced patience of a man who had spent decades letting rooms come to him instead of chasing after their attention. "Mr. Cole, I don't believe we've been introduced," he said. "Ezra Colton, attorney representing Mr. Whitaker before Judge Voss this coming week. I've spent the better part of a week reviewing sworn statements from 6 families in this valley, all describing the same clause appearing in their notes only after tragedy struck their households. I intend to present every one of those statements to the court alongside a signed confession from a man you paid to destroy the evidence supporting them. I'd be curious to hear how you intend to explain that pattern away as grief and misremembering counselor to counselor, so to speak." "I've broken no law," Cole said, though the words came out thinner than they had a minute before. "Then you've nothing to fear from a courtroom," Colton said, mild as milk, "and I look forward to watching you prove it." The murmur that moved through the church then was not the murmur of a congregation still deciding what to believe. It was the sound of a town beginning all at once to understand exactly how long it had been lied to. Cole left the church without another word, and Silas understood watching him go that a cornered man was a more dangerous man than a confident one. He was right to worry. They came for the ranch 2 nights before the hearing 4 riders in the dark, instead of 1, and it was Tom Riggins on watch who spotted torchlight moving toward the house instead of the fields this time, and understood in the same instant that this was no fence line they meant to cut. "They're coming for Hattie," Clara said, already moving, already understanding the shape of it, before Silas had finished buckling his gun belt. Hattie Marsh had been staying in the spare room since the break-in, too frightened to remain alone in town, and Clara had known some cold certain part of her that sooner or later Cole would come to finish what threats hadn't accomplished. "Get her to the root cellar," Silas said. Now. The fight that followed was short and ugly, and lit only by torchlight and the muzzle flash of Tom's rifle from the barn loft. 4 riders meeting 6 ranch hands who'd been waiting on exactly this kind of trouble since the fire. And it ended with 2 of Cole's men face down in the yard, disarmed and bleeding, and the other 2 riding hard back the way they'd come without their nerve or their employer's $20 proving worth the risk. Silas found Clara in the root cellar afterward. Hattie Marsh trembling but unharmed beside her, and pulled her into his arms hard enough that she felt the frantic beat of his heart through his shirt. "I thought—" His voice broke on it. "When I heard the shots before I knew where you were." "I'm here," Clara said. "I'm here, Silas. We're both still here." 2 days, he said into her hair, holding on like letting go might undo the truth of it. 2 days till that hearing. And I don't know what a desperate man does with 2 days left to lose everything. Hattie Marsh, still shaking, reached out and gripped Clara's hand tight enough to hurt. He sent 4 riders after 1 widow woman and a stack of paper. Hattie said something fierce, breaking through her fear. "Man that frightened of the truth isn't a man with the law on his side, whatever badge his friends might be wearing. I'll stand in that courtroom tomorrow if I have to crawl there myself, Miss Bennett. He doesn't get to scare me quiet twice." Tom Riggins came down the cellar steps a few minutes later, a grim set to his jaw that told Silas there was more news yet to come. "Both men we caught are talking," Tom said. "Scared enough now they're falling over each other trying to name who paid them first. Cole's name's coming out of both their mouths plain as day." "Then get it written down," Silas said. "Sworn if you can find anybody in this valley still willing to notarize a statement against Amos Cole before sunup." "Yeah." The answer came the next morning in the shape of Sheriff Dale Whitcomb, riding up the drive with 2 deputies flanking him and a folded paper in his hand that Silas recognized even from a distance as trouble wearing the shape of the law. Silas Whitaker. Whitcomb didn't dismount, same trick Cole favored, the same easy authority of a man used to being obeyed without argument. "Got a warrant here for your arrest. Assault and unlawful imprisonment of a man named Frank Dooley, held against his will in your barn going on 11 days now. That man broke into my home and confessed to theft on Cole's orders," Silas said, in front of witnesses. "That's not what the complaint says," Whitcomb said, And something in the careful, rehearsed way he said it told Silas exactly whose hand had guided the writing of it. Complaint says you and your men beat a confession out of an innocent traveler and been holding him against his will ever since. I've got no choice but to bring you in, Whitaker, whatever the truth of it turns out to be, once a judge sorts through the particulars. The hearing's tomorrow, Clara said, stepping forward, understanding arriving cold and fast. You mean to arrest him the night before the hearing so he can't stand in that courtroom? Whitcomb didn't answer her. He didn't need to. The answer was written plain across his face in the careful way he avoided meeting her eyes in the folded paper he was already unfolding to read the charges out loud. This is Cole's doing, Silas said, and you know it, Whitcomb. You've known him 15 years, same as everyone else in this valley, and you're standing in my yard doing his bidding. Same as that man in my barn was doing it for $20. I've got a signed complaint and a judge's warrant. Whitcomb said, though something in his voice had gone tight uncomfortable, a man performing a duty he didn't much care for. Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Whitaker. Ezra Colton stepped forward from the porch, unhurried as ever, though there was nothing mild left in his expression now. Sheriff, I'd advise caution here, Colton said. Mr. Whitaker's confinement the night before a scheduled territorial hearing on a complaint filed by the very man whose conduct that hearing is meant to examine is going to look like exactly what it is to any judge above Voss's bench who happens to review it afterward. I intend to file that observation with the territorial court myself first thing tomorrow morning. Whether Mr. Whitaker is standing beside me in that courtroom or sitting in your jail cell instead. Whitcomb's jaw tightened, some private calculation working behind his eyes, but the warrant in his hand didn't waver. That's a fight for tomorrow, counselor. Today I've got a warrant to serve. Then serve it, Silas said quiet, holding his wrists out before either deputy could reach for him. But you tell Amos Cole something for me when you report back to him tonight. Tell him a night in your jail isn't going to stop that hearing from happening. Tell him Ezra Colton walks into that courtroom tomorrow with or without me standing beside him, and every piece of evidence we've gathered walks in right along with him. I'll be there too, Clara said, stepping up beside him, her voice steady despite the fear plain in her eyes. Every single word of it, Silas. I promise you that. The deputies led him toward their horses, and Clara stood in the yard with Ezra Colton and Tom Riggins, and every ranch hand who'd come running at the sound of horses in the drive watching the man she loved ride away in rope binding meant for a criminal one day, before the truth was finally supposed to see daylight. They can't keep him past the hearing, Colton said low, mostly to himself, already turning over the legal ground in his mind the way Clara turned over ledgers. A warrant this thin won't hold past a day or two once a real judge looks at it proper. But a day or two is exactly what Cole needs, isn't it? Just enough time to make sure Silas Whitaker isn't sitting in that courtroom tomorrow when the truth finally gets said out loud. Clara watched the dust settle behind the sheriff's horses, feeling something harden in her chest that had nothing left of fear in it. Then I suppose it falls to the rest of us, she said, to make sure the truth gets said anyway. Ezra Colton did not sleep that night, and neither did Clara. They sat at the kitchen table until the lamp burned low, Colton drafting and redrafting a petition by hand, while Clara organized every sworn statement, every letter, every scrap of evidence into an order she could recite blind if a courtroom demanded it of her. Somewhere past midnight, her hands stopped moving altogether, and Colton looked up from his own work to find her staring at nothing. The fight gone out of her posture for the first time since he'd arrived in the valley. He'll be all right, Colton said gentler than his usual courtroom cadence. Whitcomb's not fool enough to let real harm come to a man he knows the whole valley's watching. It isn't Silas I'm afraid for tonight. Clara's voice had gone small in a way it rarely did. It's tomorrow. I've spent 3 years believing if I just gathered enough truth, stacked it high enough, somebody with the power to matter would finally have to look at it. And now here I am, hours from finding out if that was ever true, or if I've just been telling myself a comforting story, same as everybody else in this valley's been telling themselves about Amos Cole all along. It was never a story, Colton said. I've read every page of what you've built these past weeks, Miss Bennett, and I've argued in front of enough juries to know the difference between wishful thinking and a case that holds. What you've assembled holds. Whether Judge Voss chooses to see it tomorrow is a separate question from whether it's true, and don't let one crooked man's decision convince you otherwise, whichever way it falls." Clara nodded slow and picked her pencil back up. "There's a territorial marshal," Colton went on, somewhere past 2 in the morning, setting down his pen long enough to rub the exhaustion from his eyes. "Name's Ambrose Kettering, stationed out of the capital, but his jurisdiction runs the whole territory when local laws compromised, and I happen to know he's been quietly gathering complaints against Amos Cole's bank for the better part of a year now, same as we have, only through federal channels instead of kitchen tables. You know this marshal personally. Argued a case in front of him 3 years back. Man doesn't care for bankers who buy sheriffs, in my experience, and he's got the authority to walk into that courtroom tomorrow and take this whole matter clean out of Judge Voss's hands if the evidence warrants it." Colton was already folding a fresh telegram, checking the wording twice. "I'm sending a writer for the telegraph office the moment the sun's up. If Kettering can reach Red Creek before that hearing convenes, we've got a chance neither Cole nor Voss is prepared for. And if he can't, then we do what we planned to do all along," Colton said. "We walk in with what we've got, and we make Amos Cole answer for every name on that list in front of God and this whole valley, marshal or no marshal." Clara rode to the jailhouse at first light, and the deputy on duty, a young man barely out of his teens, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else in the territory, let her through without much argument once she made clear she wasn't leaving until he did. Silas was sitting on a cot too short for him, unshaven, jaw tight, but his eyes came alive the moment he saw her through the bars. "Clara." "I'm not staying long," she said low, close to the bars. "Colton sent for a territorial marshal. If he reaches town before the hearing, he can pull this whole case out from under Voss and Cole both. And if he doesn't, then I walk into that courtroom without you, and I make sure every soul in that gallery hears the truth, whether Voss wants to listen or not." Her hand found his through the bars, gripped tight. "I didn't survive that snowstorm to lose you to a paid-off sheriff and a stack of false charges, Silas Whitaker. I intend to have you standing beside me again before this day's finished, one way or another. That's the woman I fell in love with," Silas said, quiet, fighting for something even when the odds are sitting square against her. Clara's breath caught. He hadn't said the word before, not plain like that, not without some circumstance forcing it out of him. "Say that again," she said. "When you're not looking at me through iron bars, and I'll believe you mean it clean through." "I mean it plenty clean right now," Silas said. "But I'll say it again tonight, Clara Bennett. Free man standing on his own 2 feet, if you'll let me." "I'll hold you to that." The young deputy cleared his throat from his post by the door, not unkindly. "Miss, I hate to rush you, but the sheriff will be back directly, and I don't imagine he'd take kindly to finding you still here. One more minute." Clara didn't look away from Silas. "Tom's got every hand on the ranch writing for testimony this morning. Anybody Cole's ever wronged, who might still be willing to stand up. Ruth Anders is spreading word through town herself, faster than any of Cole's men can get ahead of it. Whatever happens in that courtroom, Silas, you won't be the only one fighting for you today." "I know it," Silas said. Man couldn't ask for better people at his back. She pressed her hand flat against the bars one last time, and he covered it with his own. The courthouse was packed past its walls by the time the hearing was called to order. Valley families crowded into every pew, and lining the back wall, 3 deep word, having traveled faster through Red Creek than any rider could have carried it alone. Judge Harlan Voss took his seat at the bench with the unhurried confidence of a man who had already decided how this day would end, and Amos Cole sat at his table, looking considerably less composed than he had in Silas's yard weeks before, flanked by a lawyer who kept glancing nervously toward the crowded gallery. Silas was not among them. Clara sat at Colton's table instead, spine straight, hands folded tight in her lap to keep them from shaking, and felt every empty inch of the space beside her where Silas should have been sitting. "We'll proceed," Voss said, "on the matter of the Whitaker water rights review. Mr. Colton, I understand you represent the Whitaker interest in Mr. Whitaker's regrettable absence. I do, Your Honor, and I'd like the record to reflect that Mr. Whitaker's absence is the direct result of a warrant sworn out by the very party whose conduct this hearing was scheduled to examine, served not 24 hours before these proceedings on charges I intend to demonstrate are entirely without merit. Noted, Voss said, in a tone that suggested it would be noted and then promptly ignored. Now, as to the water agreement in question. The courthouse doors opened. Every head in the gallery turned, and Clara turned with them. Heart-lurching hope and fear tangled too close together to tell apart, and found not Silas, but a broad-shouldered man in a plain dark coat, with a marshal's star pinned unmistakably to his chest. 3 riders behind him, still dusty from hard travel. "Your Honor," the marshal said, striding down the center aisle without waiting to be acknowledged. "Ambrose Kettering, Territorial Marshal. I apologize for the interruption, but I believe this court is about to proceed on a matter that falls considerably outside the scope of a simple water rights dispute." Voss's composure flickered just barely the same crack Silas had seen in Cole's face weeks before. "Marshal, this is a scheduled territorial hearing, and unless you've got business before this bench, I've got a year's worth of business before this bench. Your Honor, though I confess I didn't expect to find it waiting for me quite so conveniently gathered in one room." Kettering set a heavy satchel down on the clerk's table with a thud that seemed to echo through the whole silent courthouse. "I've spent the better part of a year building a federal case against Amos Cole's banking practices based on complaints filed through territorial channels by families who'd lost land under circumstances similar to what I understand this court has already heard testimony about. I'd be obliged if this hearing proceeded with that fact in mind." Silas walked through the courthouse doors 20 minutes later, released on Kettering's authority, before the marshal had even finished explaining the scope of his investigation, and the sight of him crossing the aisle toward her free and unbound was enough to break the careful composure Clara had been holding on to all morning. She was on her feet before she'd decided to be, and he caught her halfway, and for one long moment, neither of them cared that half the valley was watching. "Told you," he murmured into her hair. "Free man standing on his own 2 feet. You cut it close." "Marshal, cut it closer. I've never been so glad to see a man with a badge in my life." They sat together at Colton's table as the hearing resumed, and what followed was not the narrow, careful proceeding Voss had clearly intended to run. Kettering's presence changed the shape of the room entirely, and one by one, the witnesses Clara had spent weeks gathering rose to speak, no longer testifying into a hearing designed to dismiss them, but into a federal investigation with the authority to make Amos Cole answer for every family on that list. Hattie Marsh spoke first. Steady, unwavering. The same words she'd said in church now entered into an official record that even Judge Voss could not simply wave aside with a bought man's authority. Randall Holloway followed, admitting his own note, his own 15 years of comfortable blindness, in a voice that cost him visibly to use. And then, to Clara's genuine surprise, Amos Sorensen rose from the back of the gallery. "I told Miss Bennett I couldn't risk what little I had left," he said, voice unsteady but carrying clear through the courtroom. "But I've sat here this morning watching a widow woman with nothing left to lose say the truth out loud when I was too frightened to say it myself, and I find I can't sit quiet a moment longer and call myself an honest man. Cole's clause appeared in my note the same way it appeared in theirs. I'll swear to it before this court and any other that asks." Cole's lawyer was on his feet objecting to something. Anything but the objection died half-formed in the face of a federal marshal's steady, unbothered gaze. Cole himself rose halfway from his chair, composure finally cracking clean through. "This is a coordinated attack, Your Honor, orchestrated by a jealous rancher and a woman with every reason to fabricate a grievance against my bank. Sit down, Mr. Cole." Voss said sharper than he'd spoken all morning, a man abruptly and visibly recalculating how much further his own name could afford to be tied to the one now unraveling beside him. Cole sat. It was the first order the judge had given all day that he did not appear to have expected. Frank Dooley's confession was read into the record next, followed by the sworn statements of the 2 men caught raiding the Whitaker Ranch 2 nights prior. And by the time Ezra Colton laid Margaret Holloway's letters on the clerk's table, entering into evidence, Cole's own written words plotting to discredit Clara's character months before any hearing had been scheduled. Amos Cole had stopped objecting entirely and sat instead with the stillness of a man watching 15 years of careful work come apart in the space of a single morning. "Your Honor," Colton said, "I believe this court has heard sufficient testimony to establish a pattern of fraud spanning 6 ranching families in this valley, executed through the systematic insertion of unauthorized clauses into promissory notes, timed deliberately to exploit families at their most vulnerable. I would respectfully suggest that any question of Whitaker water rights is, as I noted at the outset, entirely secondary to the far larger matter this court now finds itself confronting." Judge Voss sat silent a long moment, and Clara watched something calculating move behind his eyes. The same look she'd seen on Cole's face in the church. A man doing arithmetic on how much of his own comfortable arrangement with Amos Cole's bank was about to become a liability rather than an asset. "Marshal Kettering," Voss said finally, "given the federal scope of the matter you've described, I believe it falls to your jurisdiction rather than mine. This court will suspend the water rights proceeding pending the outcome of your investigation." "A wise decision, Your Honor," Kettering said, and something in his tone made clear he understood exactly what calculation had produced it. "I'll also be requesting a review of this court's own financial records, given certain irregularities that have come to my attention regarding this bench's relationship with the defendant's bank. Purely as a formality, of course." Voss's face went the color of old parchment, and he did not argue the point. Amos Cole was arrested before he ever left the courthouse, marshals men on either side of him, as he was led out past a gallery that watched in a silence too heavy to call satisfaction, though satisfaction was somewhere buried in it. "You'll regret this," Cole said low, as he passed the table where Clara sat. The same threat he'd made to Silas weeks before in a very different yard, though it carried none of its old weight now. "All of you, I imagine, will manage," Clara said, and did not look away from him until he was gone. The courthouse emptied Slow Valley families lingering in small clusters, talking in the low, stunned tones of people who had just watched something they'd assumed permanent finally come apart. Margaret Holloway stood near the back wall, apart from the crowd watching Clara with an expression that had nothing left of the fury from weeks before, only something quieter and harder to name. "Your letters mattered," Clara told her, crossing to stand beside her rather than waiting for Margaret to approach. "Whatever else is true that mattered today." "I know it," Margaret said. "Doesn't undo what I did before it. But I'm glad it counted for something at the end." "It's a start," Clara said, echoing words she'd used weeks before under very different circumstances. "That's usually all any of us get to begin with." Amos Sorensen found Clara on the steps outside a few minutes later, hat in hand. Something like shame and relief, both moving across his weathered face. "I'm sorry it took me so long to find my courage," he said. "Should have stood up alongside you from the start." "You stood up when it mattered," Clara said. "That's what counts, Mr. Sorensen. Not when a person finds their courage, only that they finally do." The ranch had never looked so full as it did that evening. Tom Riggins had every hand gathered in the yard before the wagon even came into view, word of the verdict having outrun the wagon itself. The way word always seemed to outrun everything in Red Creek Valley, and the shout that went up when Silas and Clara rode through the gate together was loud enough to set the horses stamping in their pens. Mrs. Odom had a supper laid out fit for a wedding before either of them had climbed down from the bench, and Ruth Anders had ridden out from town herself, still in her post office apron, unwilling to wait even one more day to hear the whole of it firsthand. 6 families, Ruth said, shaking her head, slow wonder plain on her face. 15 years that man's been walking this valley like he owned every soul in it, and it took a woman he tried to leave dying in a snowbank to finally bring him down. "Took more than one woman," Clara said. "Took Hattie Marsh standing up in a church pew, and Amos Sorensen finding his courage on a courthouse bench, and Margaret Holloway handing over letters that could have ruined her own family's name along with Cole's. Took a whole valley finally deciding it was tired of being afraid." Tom Riggins raised his cup toward her, something like pride plain on his weathered face. "Wasn't but a few months back, I was watching you cross this yard in a coat 3 sizes too big, wondering what a half-starved house guest could possibly know about horses. Reckon I stand corrected on more than horses, ma'am. Reckon you do, Clara said, and the whole yard laughed warm and easy, the particular laughter of people who had been holding their breath together for weeks and had finally been given leave to let it go. They rode home together as the afternoon light was going long and gold across the valley. Silas's hand finding hers on the wagon bench somewhere along the road, and neither of them spoke for a long while. The events of the day too large, yet to fit into easy conversation. Kettering says it'll take months to sort through everything, Silas said finally. Every note, every deed Coles Bank ever touched, your father's land included. Months, Clara repeated, testing the shape of the word. After 3 years, I suppose I can manage months. You won't have to manage them alone. Clara looked out over the valley, gold light settling soft across land that had once belonged to families who'd lost it to a man now riding toward a federal cell instead of home to his fine house in town. I keep thinking about my father, she said quiet. He'd have liked seeing this day come, though I doubt he ever imagined it would take his daughter freezing half to death in a snowbank to bring it about. He always did say the truth had a way of surfacing, eventually, given enough time and enough stubborn people willing to keep digging for it. Sounds like a man I'd have gotten along with. He'd have liked you, Clara said, and meant it, something soft moving behind her tired eyes. Might have taken him a while to admit it, same as it took me, but he'd have liked you fine in the end. Something in his voice made her turn, and she found him watching her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before, steady and certain, in a way that went past the exhaustion and relief of the day. I made you a promise this morning, Silas said. Through iron bars, which isn't the circumstance I'd have chosen for it, but I meant every word regardless. I love you, Clara Bennett. Not for what you've done for this ranch, though. God knows you've done plenty, and not out of gratitude for pulling me out of some lonely, guarded life I'd built for myself before you came along. I love you because you walked out of a snowstorm with nothing left to your name and never once stopped fighting for yourself, for your father's memory. For 6 families this valley had already given up on. I don't intend to spend one more day without telling you so plainly, where you can see my face when I say it. Clara's eyes had gone bright, and this time she didn't try to hide it. I love you too, she said. Have for a while now, if I'm honest, longer than I've had the courage to admit out loud. Man who digs a dying stranger out of a snowbank and never once asks what she's worth first, that's not a thing a woman forgets how to love once she lets herself start. Silas pulled the wagon to a stop there on the road. The valley spread out gold and quiet around them, and kissed her slow and certain. No fire burning nearby. This time, no crisis pressing at their backs. Only the plain, steady fact of 2 people who had fought their way toward each other and finally arrived. Marry me, he said against her lips, not quite a question. Not because the valley expects it, not because it would settle any arrangement between families. Marry me because I can't picture one more sunrise on that ranch that doesn't have you standing in it. Yes, Clara said, no hesitation left in her at all. Yes, Silas. 1,000 times yes, and gladly. The wagon sat still on the quiet road a long while after that, and neither of them was in any hurry to move it. Word came from the territorial capital 3 weeks later, delivered by the same rider who'd once carried Amos Cole's wax-sealed threats. Though this time, the paper he handed Silas carried an entirely different weight. Silas read it standing in the yard, Clara close beside him, and felt something in his chest loosen that had been wound tight since the night that first letter arrived. They've voided it, he said, voice rough. The clause, the note, all of it. Kettering's office is restoring title on every parcel Coles Bank seized under that scheme going back the full 12 years. He looked up at her disbelief, and joy tangled together plain on his face. Clara, your father's land. It's yours again. Clara took the paper with hands that had gone unsteady, reading the words twice the way she'd read every other piece of paper that had ever changed the shape of her life, and this time when her eyes filled, it wasn't grief that put the tears there. 300 acres. She said quiet, like she was afraid saying it too loud might make it disappear. Silas, that's my father's land. That's the house I grew up in, the pasture he raised me riding across before I could properly read. It's yours, Silas said again. free and clear with the territory's own apology attached to the deed for whatever an apology's worth after 3 years. Clara pressed the paper to her chest, and for a long moment she didn't trust herself to speak at all. As she rode out to see it the following morning alone, because some things a person needed to face without an audience, even a beloved one. The house had gone to ruin some in 3 years of standing empty, roof-sagging porch boards rotted through in places, but the bones of it were still there, still solid, still unmistakably the house her father had built with his own 2 hands. She stood in the yard a long while, remembering him teaching her to ride before she could read, remembering the particular way he'd whistled coming up from the barn each evening, so she'd always know it was him and not a stranger. She let herself cry there finally, 3 years of grief and fury and fear, all coming loose at once, in a place that had waited patiently for her to come back and grieve it properly. When Silas found her an hour later, having ridden out to check on her when she hadn't returned by noon, she was sitting on the porch steps, dry-eyed and steady, looking out over pasture gone wild with 3 years of neglect. "I know what I want to do with it," she said, before he'd even climbed down from his horse. "Tell me." Hattie Marsh has been renting a room from her own sister for 2 years, ashamed every single day of it, though she's got nothing in this world to be ashamed of. Clara's voice had gone certain, the same steel it carried when she'd first stood up to Margaret Holloway in Silas's yard. "I want to give her the house. Not sell it, not rent it. Give it to her outright, deed and all. So she's got a roof over her head that's hers, free and clear, same as this land is mine now. And the pasture, the acreage." "I was thinking," Clara said, "we might run it as part of the Whitaker operation if you'll have it. My father's land joined to yours the way it might have been all along if Cole had never gotten his hands on either of our families. Feels fitting somehow. Feels like the ending my father would have wanted even if he never got to see it." Silas sat down on the step beside her, took her hand. "Feels like exactly the right ending," he said. She rode to town the following week to deliver the deed herself. Finding Hattie Marsh in her sister's cramped spare room, mending a torn hem by lamplight, same as she'd been doing every evening since Clara had first met her. "Got something for you," Clara said, setting the paper on the small table between them. Hattie read it slow twice the same way Clara had read her own restored deed, and when she finally looked up, her hands were trembling too hard to hold the paper steady. "Miss Bennet, I can't accept this. It's your father's house, your land." "It's mine to give," Clara said, gentle but immovable. "And I've decided what I want to do with it is put a roof over the head of the woman brave enough to stand up in a church pew when nobody else in this valley would. You've spent 2 years apologizing to your own sister for the space you take up in her house, Hattie. I won't have you spending 2 more. I don't know how to thank you for something like this." "You already have," Clara said. "You thanked me the day you stood up and told the truth, knowing full well what it might cost you. This is just me finally being in a position to pay that debt back proper." Hattie Marsh cried, then unashamed, and Clara sat with her a long while in that cramped little room, holding her hand the same steady way Silas had once held hers through iron bars until the tears had run their course and something like peace had settled in behind them. She moved into the house before the week was out, and the first evening smoke curled up from that chimney again. Clara stood at the edge of the property and let herself believe finally that some wounds really could be mended, given enough patience and enough people willing to do the mending. Done so. The wedding was set for the first Saturday of autumn, and Red Creek Valley turned out for it in numbers that surprised even Mrs. Odom, who had been fretting over the guest count for a solid week beforehand. Hattie Marsh came, moved into her new home only days before glowing in a way Clara hadn't seen from her since that first cautious conversation over weak coffee. Amos Sorensen brought his whole family, his boy healthy, and running wild through the yard with the other children, his wife embracing Clara like she'd known her a lifetime instead of a handful of desperate months. Even the Coopers came, baby now old enough to toddle after the other children. Ezra Cooper shaking Silas's hand with the particular gratitude of a man who understood exactly what courage other people's had cost them, and what safety his own caution had bought. "Wish I'd had the nerve to stand with you both when it counted," Cooper said. Proud to stand here now at least and see how it all came out." "You've got nothing to apologize for," Clara told him. "You protected your family. That's never a thing to be sorry about whatever else came of it." Margaret Holloway came too, standing a little apart from the rest of the crowd. Though Randall Holloway stood beside his daughter with none of the old bluster, only quiet, chastened pride. When the ceremony ended and the crowd began to mingle, it was Margaret who crossed to Clara first. Something almost shy in the gesture. "You look happy," Margaret said. "Truly happy. I find I'm glad of it, which surprises me more than I expected it would." "Thank you for coming," Clara said, and meant it. "I don't know that I deserve the welcome," Margaret admitted, "but I'm trying to become someone who might eventually. Watching you fight for what was right, even when I made it harder, I think it taught me something about the kind of woman I'd like to be if I ever find the courage for it." "Then you're already further along than you think," Clara said. "Recognizing it is half the battle. The rest just takes time." The ceremony itself was simple, held in the yard where Clara had first walked out to face down Margaret Holloway, where Duke the cutting horse had first let a stranger lift his hoof, where 6 weeks of ledgers and irrigation ditches and hard truths had slowly, steadily built something neither Silas nor Clara had believed themselves capable of finding again. Reverend Hollis, who'd buried more of Cole's victims than he cared to count, and had watched the valley's slow reckoning with something like grim satisfaction. These past months spoke the vows plain and unhurried, and when he asked if any man objected to the union, the silence that followed was the good kind, the kind that comes from a whole community finally settled on the same understanding. "Silas Whitaker," Reverend Hollis said, "do you take this woman in sickness and in health, in wealth and in hardship, forsaking all others, so long as you both shall live?" "I do," Silas said, and there wasn't a soul in that yard who doubted the weight behind the words. Not after everything they'd watched the two of them survive together. "And Clara Bennett, soon to be Whitaker, do you take this man in sickness and in health, in wealth and in hardship, forsaking all others, so long as you both shall live?" "I do," Clara said, steady and sure, the same voice that had once told a dying stranger's rescuer why she'd been fighting to survive in the first place. "I did the moment he pulled me out of that snowbank, if I'm honest, even if it took us both a while longer to say so out loud." The kiss that followed drew the loudest cheer Red Creek Valley had heard in longer than anyone could remember. And somewhere in the crowd, Tom Riggins was heard to remark loud enough for half the yard to hear that he'd never once in 11 years of ranch work seen a woman turn a place around. The way Clara Whitaker had turned around the Whitaker spread, and he didn't expect he'd see the like of it again. Ezra Colton raised a glass once the tables had been laid out beneath the late afternoon sun, standing to offer a toast in the unhurried, deliberate cadence he'd once used to unravel Amos Cole's fraud in front of a packed courtroom. "I've argued more cases than I care to count in 30 years of practicing law," Colton said, "and I've rarely seen one where the evidence and the heart of the matter lined up quite so plainly as they did in this valley. I came here to fight a water rights dispute. I leave having watched a woman rebuild 6 families' faith in the truth, and a man brave enough to burn down his own comfortable life to make room for somebody who actually deserved to share it with him. To Silas and Clara Whitaker. May every acre of this valley remember what it cost to make it honest again, and may it never forget." The toast was met with a roar of approval, loud enough to startle the horses in the far pen, and Clara, laughing, wiped at her eyes and leaned into Silas's side, feeling for the first time in longer than she could remember, like she had landed finally exactly where she was always meant to be. Amos Cole's sentencing came down 2 months later, delivered by federal letter to Ezra Colton, who wrote out personally to share the news, rather than trust it to any messenger less invested in seeing it through. 15 years, the letter said, for fraud spanning more than a decade restitution, ordered to every family his scheme had touched, his bank's assets seized and liquidated to fund the repayment. Judge Voss had resigned his bench rather than face the inquiry. Kettering's investigation had opened into his own finances, and the territorial governor had appointed a new judge for the District 1, with no debts owed to any banker in the valley. 15 years, Silas said, reading it over Clara's shoulder in the kitchen, where so much of this fight had first taken root. Man spent that long building his fortune off other people's grief. Feels almost fitting he'll spend the same span answering for it. It won't give the Sorensens back the years they spent afraid, Clara said. Won't give Hattie back her husband, or give me back the years I spent walking from one strange kitchen to the next. But it's something. It's the Valley finally saying out loud that what happened to us mattered. It's more than something, Silas said. It's justice plain and earned, same as everything else you fought this hard to build. Word of the sentencing spread through Red Creek Valley, same as every other piece of news eventually did, and this time nobody whispered it behind closed doors or over careful cups of coffee. Ruth Anders read the notice aloud at the Mercantile to anyone who'd stand still long enough to listen, and Amos Sorensen was heard telling his boy, loud and proud, that the valley they'd grow up in was an honest one now, thanks to a woman brave enough to keep digging for the truth long after everyone else had given up looking for it. Spring came to the Whitaker Ranch. Whitaker and Bennett both. Now the two properties joined into one operation running more cattle and more acreage than either family had managed alone. And Clara stood at the edge of her father's old pasture, now green again, after a winter of careful tending, watching Silas break a young colt in the near pen with the same patient, steady hands that had once dug her free from a snowdrift and never once let go since. She thought of the woman she'd been that first freezing night, half buried, and certain she was dying, certain the world had already decided everything it needed to know about a big, plain-dressed orphan with nothing left to her name. She thought of every door that had closed on her before Silas Whitaker's had opened, every voice that had told her in ways loud and quiet, both exactly how little she was worth. They had all been wrong. Red Creek Valley had learned slow and hard and honest the same lesson Clara had spent her whole life waiting for someone to finally understand, that a person's worth was never carried in the size of her dress, or the weight of her family name, never measured in land or money, or the easy approval of people who'd never once had to fight for anything themselves. It lived instead in the courage to keep walking when the cold should have stopped her, in the stubbornness to keep counting truth against lies, until the truth finally outweighed them, in the simple, unshakable decision to stand beside the people worth standing beside, no matter what it cost. Silas Whitaker had turned away every woman the Valley told him he ought to want, because none of them had ever offered him what Clara Bennett gave without even trying. A love built on truth instead of convenience, on courage instead of comfort, on two people who had both been broken by the world and had chosen against every reasonable expectation to build something whole together instead. And in the end, that was the only inheritance either of them had ever truly needed. Not land, not money, not a name. The Valley whispered with respect, but a home built by two people who had found each other exactly when the world had counted them both as lost, and who had never once from that first snowbound night forward let go.